The History of Things podcast is brought to you by HistoryNet, publisher of 9 different historical magazines including the Civil War Times, American History, and Military History. Visit HistoryNet.com to learn more or follow them on social media by searching for @history_net. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy the show.
Are you ready?
Welcome back, everybody, to the History Things podcast. I'm your host, Matt Borders, and today we are continuing our coverage of the ongoing 160th commemoration of the Gettysburg Campaign. With me, as always, of course, is my co-host with the most. It's Pat McGuire.
What's up, guys? How are you all doing? I don't know where I'm at right now, Matt. I can't tell you if I am super pumped to be engaged with the Gettysburg subject, because you know how I normally feel about talking about Gettysburg. There's a whole other war. We haven't introduced our guest yet, but he's nodding at me. He acknowledges there is a whole rest of this war. But I also can't tell if I'm also super pumped, because I've watched the movie about 1,000 times now. Sure. I said I wouldn't. We had Scott Hartwig in here. We talked about how much I hated all that stuff, but yet I'm fanboying and doing it anyway. Stupid Chamberlain. Let's get the bayonets. Let's go! Anyway, as you can tell, everyone, I am all over the place, but I'm excited today because we have a story that is a part of this battle. It's a part of these 3 days, and it gets often overlooked. I'm not sure why. In the last few years, though, it started to get some elevation, I guess, some light shined on it.
Due to our guest,
yeah,
actually.
I mean, our guest is definitely a small part of it. A small part of it. It's like, I'm just kidding. Him and probably one other person also affiliated as a guest with our show, or maybe the only 2 guys talking about it. And you guys work together. Don't say anything because we haven't introduced you yet. You can't. Just zip it. Anyway, actually, let's just get right to it because I'm super excited to have our guest here today. Matt, who are we talking to, buddy?
We have the Director of Education and Museums Operations at the Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center in Gettysburg. Codie Eash himself is here in the studio.
Hey, yo, Codie. Say hey, Codie. Is that how it goes?
I wouldn't say hey, Codie, myself, but yeah. Hey, Matt. Hey, Matt.
A pleasure to have you here, sir.
Yeah.
Oh, man, I'm excited to have you here on this show because we have done the Battles and Banter show that you do with our friend Avery quite a bit. Obviously, you have ducked me for a while. We could have beef. We could do this off mic. We could do this on mic. Codie, it's your choice. It's up to you. But, I'm glad to finally catch up with you and actually get to have a chat about what we love, history stories. So thanks for coming into our world to do that.
Happy to be here. Happy our paths finally crossed.
Yes, man. Finally, after 3 years, I look at my imaginary watch. I think I've been the first time I appeared on your show and you weren't there was literally during the pandemic. That's 3 years ago now. Isn't it crazy that the pandemic and we all went home and started a lot of this stuff was 3 years ago already? Yeah. Super fast.
And continuing have that thought of have I ever met this person in person?
In person.
Yes.
Sometimes you meet on Zoom and still not meet in person for quite some time.
Rich Connon and I, we've never met in person.
Seriously?
Wait,
never
met
met in
so that's the person I was alluding to that you work with. So you have actually never met Rich in person?
Nope. Only over Zoom, maybe at least a dozen times, more than that probably. But we realized that within the past year.
I can't act like that's shocking. I did an entire album with a guy, and we were never in the same place at one time. The digital age is wonderful.
Yeah. Almost positive I have actually been physically in the same room as Rich, but I'm not certain I have now that you say that.
I can confirm you have, Matt. We did your program at Monocacy
Oh,
after
that's right.
hours.
He was there. Yes. Excellent.
So
Excellent.
Matt wrote a program in which he had researched and been a part of a group of people that had researched, I guess, all the known names of the enslaved at Monocacy and the USCT enlisted at Monocacy. And so we did this program where we just, we wanted to give a brief history as to that experience, both those experiences at the battlefield there. And then we wanted just to simply say their names out loud, just like roll call. Because when you say their name, keeps them alive in a sense. So we did this roll call, and Rich was a part of it. Rich literally drove in from Pittsburgh
That's right,
just
he
to be a
did.
part of it. And Matt, right here on the show, is like, I don't know if I've ever met Rich.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Oh, I love it. So let's talk about you, Codie. You do obviously a lot of work in the history field, both you with your job that you do very directly professionally, but you do a lot of writing, a lot of speaking on the side. So, let's start with you. What do you do in the world professionally? Where are people going to engage with your work the most?
Sure. So my 9 to 5 is, which is usually not 9 to 5 these days, is Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center in Gettysburg, housed in historic Schmucker Hall, the original seminary building, which has stood since 1832. Our museum turns 10 years old this year, July 1st, 2013.
Which
We
is
opened-
also wild that it's already been 10 years.
It's nuts, yeah. And I've been there the whole time. I started as an intern in fall of 2012, became part of the paid staff part-time in 2013, and then part of the full-time staff. Wow, already, I guess, since 2017. So
Wow.
it's just one of those things that's kind of nuts. But Director of Education and Operations for about 2 years now, since 2021. Oversee pretty much anything pertaining to the operations of the facility itself, oversee the visitor services staff, and do most of the student programming, field trip programming, get to interpret the campus, the cupola, the Lee's headquarters property with our friends at American Battlefield Trust. Mm-hmm. See me on the road at Civil War roundtables and historical societies, and yeah, you name it. If we talk about it, typically I'm on the team that gets the opportunity to do just that, whether on site or on the road.
Very cool, man. Obviously, a lot of our listeners know you from their listenership of Battles and Banter podcast. Can you talk a little bit about just what it's like, having these dual worlds where you have to exist, in the extreme professionalism that is the modern, history field, and then when you get to kind of let your proverbial hair down. I say that as a bald guy. I have no hair to literally let down, but if you come to my site, there is a version of me that is not sitting behind this microphone, and then there's the version of me that sits behind this microphone. So can you just talk a little bit about is it weird to do those two things? I know you guys are sort of in a quiet mode right now, but when you guys were very active as a show, was it sort of weird to this world, that world? Matt and I talk about this a lot, so just we don't get often many guests that do the same thing that we do.
Yeah, I think so. I think it does. It provides such a great opportunity, though, to talk with friends, both Tony and Avery, former colleagues, but to talk with friends about things that I don't get to talk about on a daily basis. Where at Seminary Ridge, we interpret multiple different facets of not just military history and the story of the battle, but the story of Civil War medicine, the story of slavery and emancipation, and the issues that lead to the Civil War and the legacies of the Civil War. But I can expand with something like Battles and Banter beyond Gettysburg, beyond the Civil War. And what it really has done for me personally over the past several years is so many conflicts that I never touched on in my own research, my own reading. It gave me an opportunity to do that and to flesh out my understandings of that with friends, with co-hosts, with guests, and to think about just the wide world of military history, both real world history, but also fictionalized battles.
Been a part of a few of those. Matt and I have been a part of a few of those. I wonder if this experience, Codie, is what Matt goes through on our show, because the same thing here is we didn't want to be stuck into one subject, because professionally we live in, I was thinking, even as varied as the world you're talking about there is professionally, it's still all focused around sort of the subject matter of the American Civil War. Same thing like where I work, I have a vast history to talk about a lot of things, but it's all sort of this narrow related to one thing, and that's the place I work. Same thing with you, Matt, the battlefield. So, with the show here, we wanted to be able to go from Titanic to the Somme to maybe outer space one day to, Civil War, wherever, right? So, that's pretty cool. By the way, Matt, meet Cody, you guys are the same person for the show. You guys are the serious guys, the guys that
That's
bring...
what we've been told.
You guys bring the gravitas to what ridiculousness we do. Essentially, Frederick the Great said, artillery brings dignity to what is otherwise a vulgar affair.
brawl.
Something similar along those lines. You guys are the artillery of the podcasting world here, because there are guys like me who sit here and are just all over the map. And for those of you who don't realize, like, I am all over the map by design, but this is sort of what it is. And then you guys come in with this, like, okay, enough joking around. Here's what really happened. Here's some serious stuff, citations and everything.
Well, we do try,
especially because Matt is a citations guy. So anyway, let's get right into it. I want to get to this story. I'm very excited about it. We just spent a bunch of hours sitting around with the legendary Scott Hartwig. Matt, was that his? We're still fanboying.
Absolutely.
Oh my God!
An amazing
the man
experience.
sat in this room. It was awesome. Cody, we're fanboying about you, but we won't fanboy to your face. You got to be cool to people's faces when you leave. Oh my God, Cody was here. But Scott Hartwig sat in
Especially if
this.
they're as legendary as Scott Hartwig.
Yeah, Scott Hartwig
Which was a term we used.
is one that inspires so many of us, so many. And he sat here, and it was mesmerizing to hear essentially what felt like a personal story from Scott Hartwig about the Battle of Gettysburg. It was awesome, incredible, and we're going to now dive deep into one of those little stories that we did not get into. I think we briefly touch on it, but we wanted to kind of back off, and I think we told Scott, whoa, hit the brakes, Chief.
We've got a specialist for this.
We've got our own legend to talk about it. And he was like, oh, you mean? And we said, shh, you don't say his name, right?
So
Keep his
Cody-
name out of your mouth.
We're not going down that road. When it comes to the story that you're going to present to us today, I believe you originally did this for the Winter Speaker Series up there at Gettysburg, and then you've also since done it for Battles and Banter as well. So this is something you've done a lot of research on. Why don't you take us into it? Who are we talking about, and what is the event with this gentleman?
Sure. So, Brigadier General Alexander Hayes commands a division. Yes, a hearty woo is necessary for Alexander Hayes.
I'll do that one in post. I'll give you some backup, man. Don't worry. It'll sound like you and 1,000 men behind you. Woo!
But divisional commander in the United States Second Corps. And on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, following the repulse of what we know best today as Pickett's Charge, Hayes and two of his staff officers, George Courts and David Shields, and David Shields will be almost just as key of a character in the story as Hayes himself, they'll take captured Confederate battle flags and they'll drag them across Cemetery Ridge on still a bloodstained battlefield, on still an active battlefield in many regards, as Confederate forces are beginning the process of licking their wounds and retreating back across the field between Cemetery Ridge and Seminary Ridge. And you'll see this story referred to typically in just kind of passing references or brief notes in footnotes of battle histories, especially those that focus on July 3rd or on Pickett's Charge particularly. Oftentimes, though, you'll only see really kind of one, maybe two accounts that were recorded through the years. One of those accounts does come from David Shields, as I mentioned, one of Hayes's aides, written nearly 60 years after the Civil War. And, of course, with that in mind, we were just talking about citations and sources. The first thing that comes to mind is I keep seeing the same reference to the same source in half a dozen or so battle histories. And you start to wonder, all right, well, what else is there? Or is there anything else that points us to what happened? Did others remember this? Did any Confederate soldiers write about this? And so ultimately it led me down a rabbit hole, summer of 2016, 17, somewhere around there, looking through the Gettysburg National Military Park library files as well as regimental histories, some memoirs, and came up thus far with about 24 eyewitness accounts.
24, wow.
Yeah, so it happened. It's one of those things that it's rare that we find, we're able to triangulate sources on a particular moment in history, find 3 accounts, let alone 8 times that number, 24 eyewitness accounts. And I think it just speaks to the impact of the moment, on what this meant sort of as a symbolic gesture of dragging an enemy's battle flag right after what is arguably their key defeat and your army's key victory in Hayes' case, and ultimately was able to determine that soldiers of both armies were able to see this all the way from enlisted men who are writing diary entries and letters on July 3rd and July 4th from the battlefield, through these accounts that are published 50, 60 years after the battle, I think paying homage to the lasting impact that this had. And also the fact that we can place, as we'll talk about, both Army commanders, both George Meade on the U.S. side and Robert E. Lee on the Confederate side, not through accounts of their own, but through accounts of others around them who are witnessing this event. Everyone seems to have witnessed this or understood its impact almost immediately in many instances. So a really deeply symbolic event, a controversial event, of course, just based on the nature of what it is. And I think also a reminder that we often need that the debates we have over Civil War memory, Civil War iconography, the controversy of the Civil War itself, none of these things are new. They don't just pop up randomly. It's cyclical, and it began with the Civil War generation itself. A Civil War is by nature a controversial event. Otherwise, hundreds of thousands of people aren't going to die. Yeah.
You don't say. By the way, the modern news cycle didn't create this. If that's what if you missed it, what Codie was just saying there, this isn't the modern media's problem. This is a thing that's been there since it happened. Plain said. I want to illustrate or highlight that. Like when you were saying that, I was mesmerized because you're right. It is, and it's funny that I remember as a kid, this got controversial for a moment because of the way that there was police treatment of African Americans in California. There was the Rodney King incident, things like that, and then it kind of chilled out. But here it's back again. Like 30. It's not new. It's not even new in my lifetime. It won't be. It's a day one thing, and we talked about that with Scott. I guess. I don't even know our own schedule of our show. Like I mentioned, I was an amateur when we had Melissa on. Like I don't even know when this Scott's second episode isn't out yet, right? Like we have to have. Yes, right. Math. So yes, you haven't even heard it yet. We're going to get into that with Scott, where we actually talk about the fact that this is a contemporary issue in terms of how we look at the war, how the men and women themselves look at the war,
historical memory.
Yeah, historical memory and things like that. I also want to just put it out there. If your brain is like mine, as much gravitas as Codie is going to bring to this story, I imagine this entire thing to be like. Because at one point you're going to describe Lee's sort of perspective, and I imagine that it's going to be Lee imagines Stone Cold Steve Austin's glass shattering, and he looks over, and here comes Hayes, just Stone Cold Steve Austin shotgunning a beer, dragging the flag, I imagine the heavy metals playing and everything. That's what I imagine. It's not like that, but it kind of has that shock power. To take a ridiculous moment and kind of make it serious, when Matt would be standing in the ring thinking it was over, and then here comes Pat McGuire, Steve Austin, that's kind of what happened there. Coming for the title belt, Matt.
That's not kind of. That's exactly.
That's exactly what happened. Show over. We don't even need Codie. I'm the new legend now. I'm just kidding. So anyway, let's get into it. Let's talk about. I guess let's take the Army, Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble, because I refuse to call it Pickett's charge. It's a thing I'd want to die on this hill on this show. He's not the only division commander there. It's Longstreet's assault. Lee gives the order. Pickett didn't decide on any of this. He just executed it and asked where his division went afterwards. As they are all coming back across this deadly space, this 1 mile that now is littered with their own dead, dying, wounded. Take us into the moment. How does it occur? Does this moment occur sort of very naturally, or does it happen intentionally? Is somebody rub it in their face? How does this happen?
It's a little bit of everything there. It's one of those things where it's not black and white. There's some nuance, and as we'll see as we go through a handful of these accounts, as is the case with any historic event, especially related to military history, people remember it a little bit differently. How it started, what happened during it, what was said, what flags were flown, those sorts of things. I think that the best jumping off point probably is to go to David Shields, who writes this most famous account in a biography of Hayes called The Life and Letters of Alexander Hayes, which is published by a military historian named George Thornton Fleming in 1919. And he will invite David Shields as Hayes's former aide, as a friend of the Hayes family, to write the Gettysburg chapter. And a large piece of that Gettysburg chapter will be Shields's remembrance of what happened. And this is the way that he describes it, and I think he does it with a wonderful narrative flair of, starting out with sort of this relatively vague description that I can imagine a reader who is totally unaware of this story for the first time in 1919 is kind of leaning into to the storyteller. And these are his words. These are David Shields in 1919. He says, "The incident I am about to relate is a flag incident, sufficiently striking and unusual. Flushed with the glory of our victory, in the exuberance of that great joy that comes from such a victory, looking upon the trophies of war, when the enemy were retreating in disorder and confusion, the general exclaimed, 'Boys, give me a flag.' The rebel color was handed him. He then commanded his adjutant general, Captain George P. Courts, and myself, saying, 'Get a flag, Courts, get a flag, Dave, and come on.' We each took a flag, and the general immediately dropped his flag behind his horse and trailed it in the dust and blood of the battlefield. Captain Courts and I did likewise, and we started on the grandest ride men ever took." Shields will also talk about Hayes appearing in that moment to be the hero among heroes at Gettysburg, when he then proceeded, if we want to really humanize these figures in this great show of bravado.
Yes.
Hayes then takes Shields, and Shields' words, in his hands, imprinting a kiss upon my cheek. And another observer said that Shields' boyish face was aglow with the flush of victory. And so amid grabbing these flags, shouting to his men, taking his two aides with him, Hayes' first impression is then to lay a kiss on the cheek of this beloved aide.
They know this victory is big. I also like the fact that the staff's officers kind of have no idea what's happening. They're like, "Oh, we're doing the flags. Oh, put them on the ground. Okay," and they're just kind of going with it. Good officers.
And Shields is only 19 years old at this point in time. I think Courts is around that same age as well. And they've been with Hayes since he commanded the 63rd Pennsylvania Infantry, which actually, I guess, to take half a step back, just to give a 30-second war record of Hayes here, had been in the Mexican War. Before that, had been at West Point. Was a close friend of Ulysses S. Grant. Right. The earliest photograph of either of those men is actually taken together at Camp Natchitoches, I believe it's how it's, Camp Salubrity in Natchitoches, Louisiana. Apologies to Louisianans if I'm mispronouncing.
Would you risk your life on those pronunciations of those words?
I would not. I would not. Salubrity, I'm pretty confident in. Natchitoches, I am not.
So, but that image is oftentimes misidentified, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So you have this on one side. I think I have it here. Yeah. On the left side, you have this small figure who is actually Grant. On your right side, you have this towering figure, comparatively, who is Hayes. And I think because of the mystique surrounding Grant, of the place that he'll ultimately take, of course, in American history, we want to think of Grant, I think, as the giant,
the champion.
The champion, exactly. But we have to actually flip those. And poor Hayes, oftentimes, when you see this image, it'll show both of the men. He's usually not cropped out, but it'll identify Grant and then leave Hayes totally out of it.
And some guy.
Yeah. But
I'm here too, guys.
Exactly. But Grant, of course, he'll stay in the Army in the post-Mexican War years, that interim between the Mexican War and the Civil War. Hayes will leave the Army. He'll go to California. He'll be involved in the gold rush around San Francisco. Develops cholera, or at least cholera.
I was going to ask if he struck gold, but it sounds like he struck cholera.
Struck cholera, yeah.
That's not winning.
It's not winning at all. And he's a pretty sickly guy for most of his life, especially after that point.
Oh man, hard time to be alive.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, during the Civil War, he'll fight with bouts of temporary blindness that are unexplained.
Wow.
Just consistently unhealthy throughout the course of his life. But he gets the itch when he knows that Fort Sumter has been fired upon. He had been a member of a militia unit in Pittsburgh. He was a native of Franklin, Pennsylvania, about 80 miles north of Pittsburgh, but gets the itch in Pittsburgh with this militia unit and will ultimately become part of the 12th Pennsylvania Infantry, which will be near Gettysburg for one of its first assignments, about 30 miles east of Gettysburg in the city of York, my hometown, where he'll be at Camp Scott, named for Winfield Scott. Absolutely miserable experience for Hayes. All of his letters are filled with, I just want to get to the battlefield. I think that my enlistment's going to run out before I can actually see any action. And I'm not really a fan of being an officer in a volunteer unit. So he will propose that he be made a colonel of a U.S. regular unit.
That makes sense.
As everybody wants to do at that point in
By
time.
the way, you know what? Just make me a general. Why stop there?
Exactly.
Yeah, why stop?
Yeah. And he'll go so far. This becomes a trend for Hayes that I think will carry right through to that same personality trait that leads him to this flag incident at Gettysburg. His official letter, this petition that he says about wanting to be promoted to colonel of a regular unit, he says, I'll play second fiddle to no ambitious ignoramus. And so there's this kind of cheeky bravado that we see from Hayes repeatedly. He compromises. He'll be allowed to raise a regiment of volunteers in Pittsburgh, which becomes the 63rd Pennsylvania, and he's named colonel of it and simultaneously a captain in the regular army. But he'll gain the trust of his men in the 63rd Pennsylvania pretty much immediately. Their first major action is going to be on the peninsula in 1862. He invites the band to the regimental band to go to the Confederate defenses, playing patriotic tunes louder and louder. And a lot of soldiers will say, he's this hardened guy, but he has this sort of almost playful side to him where he loves being sarcastic, loves goading rebel forces.
It sounds like he likes poking the bear.
He does. He
Pat, turn it up.
I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, interesting that before we even get to the meat and potatoes, he's already kind of needling the bear here.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn this song up real loud. Hope you like Battle Cry of Freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah! It's like, was it Battle Hymn of the Republic Intensifies? Ah! Anyway, I'm a serious person. But I just, it's funny. It's when you get to this, this isn't an isolated incident. This is really on brand for who he is. He's got, it's kind of like, in a way, being a New York Yankees fan. A lot of people can't stand the Yankees fan base because they are very, very successful, very confident, and they tell you that. And that is kind of an obnoxious thing to do on the receiving end perspective. But if you're a fan of the team that guy plays for, I don't say 27 championships as a fan because that's obnoxious, but sometimes when other people bring it up, I'm like, ha! So, this is kind of the thing. It would probably suck to be a Confederate soldier hearing the band come to your defenses and play the songs, but since I'm a Union guy, rock, dude. Rock that. Rock it loud.
He has the swagger, if you will.
Yes, that's
absolutely
right.
does.
So, on brand. So, so right away into the peninsula, into the fighting, into his Civil War career, he's saying, F you, mate.
Mm-hmm. And the war is radicalizing him as well. We can see he is at this point. It definitely does have that effect. And at this point, he doesn't go into the war giving us a sense, at least not in his published letters. And that's a footnote worth mentioning here is that when you look at the published letters that his son Gilbert has quite a role in, we see the same sort of thing with George Meade Jr. when he publishes his father's letters. They're censored. They don't include everything. They don't include every letter. There are portions of letters that are redacted without ellipses, leading you to believe that that's the entire context, but there is more. Whereas if you go into the files of Gettysburg National Military Park or the National Archives, you can find that for a lot of these letters, there's much more to it. And I'll talk about one incident here in a little while related to that, right toward the end of Hayes's life. But the war is going to really radicalize him in that while we don't know specifically what draws him into the war, is there an antipathy toward slavery? Is it just to preserve the Union? Is there a hatred of rebels? He doesn't tell us that, but we can see that third one, that hatred of rebels, that hatred of treason, that wanting to quell this rebellion, that's what this war will do to him when he sees it on the ground. And it will start to radicalize him in a racial sense as well. Hayes, as a man of his time, freely uses terms like the N-word in his letters, but starts to develop this sort of fondness, this appreciation for the fact that this is a war, as it continues, that is likely going to free the enslaved or end slavery. And we see that when, even right around before they're on the peninsula, where he'll write about being at Alexandria, Virginia, and how he hates looking across the river and he can see a slave market. He hates that. He talks about how they are in the heart of secession, or rank secession hole, I think he refers to it at one time, when they're in parts of the South. So we can definitely see those sorts of terms starting to pop out more. But he still is a big fan of George McClellan at a time when, it's relatively easy as a soldier of the Army of the Potomac to be a fan of George McClellan. But as McClellan starts to become a little more unpopular by late 62, early 63, we see Hayes turning as well and seeing that there's a bit more of a political motivation for McClellan, writing repeatedly about hoping that McClellan doesn't fall in with Democrats, with Copperheads. And we start to really see that pivot for Hayes. He hates, at the start of the war, the Lincoln administration, Republicans, especially Pennsylvania's governor, Andrew Curtin. When he is at Camp Curtin, Hayes says, writes in a letter home that we're at Camp Curtin, named in honor of our governor. I wish I could say in memory of him. And so even during the war itself, he's making these comments.
Savage, dude.
But then in the summer of 1862 is when we really see the pivot. And it's when he's grievously wounded, a leg wound at Second Manassas, Second Bull Run. Hayes, in a letter to his wife, says, I assure you it's a painful wound, but it's not dire. He says, but a quarter of an inch variation at least would have cost me my leg. And it won't cost him his leg, but he's going to go home. He's going to leave for a little while. For several months, it ends up being on crutches. He'll maneuver from Pittsburgh over to visit one of his sons, who is at a blind institute in Philadelphia. And all the while, Hayes starts to notice on the home front, he starts to see there's this Copperhead sentiment in Pennsylvania. And that makes him, at best, uneasy. At worst, as time goes on, outright belligerent, outright angry. Starts referring to traitors on the home front, things along those lines. And it will filter down through his men, his regiment, the 63rd Pennsylvania, whether he's in communication with them or however it might be. We see their writings start to reflect this as well, that there's a divide between the people who are at home and those of us who are on the front line. And there starts to become this question in Hayes's mind of, like, what if the Confederate Army would invade Pennsylvania? How would Pennsylvania react? Would Pennsylvania welcome them with open arms? Would it fight? And it becomes a deep concern to him. And we can see, of course, looking back on it, almost a bit of premonition there that by the following summer, Pennsylvania will be invaded.
We see this sort of mindset in most of the conflicts that I think we've all studied, this disconnect between the front and the home front, and how much is the home front supporting or feel about the current conflict that we're in, that sort of thing. So that's very interesting that not only are you seeing it reflected in his letters, but the men in the ranks are also reflecting those opinions and thoughts.
Yeah, certainly. And when Hayes comes back, he won't be officially attached to the 63rd Pennsylvania. Won't even be given a brigade in the same corps. But he'll be in the defenses of Washington. But we can still see through the rest of the conflict, through the regimental history of the 63rd Pennsylvania, through their monument at Gettysburg, they wanted to feature Hayes at the top of it, and that's ultimately denied because not allowed, fast forwarding the story here, but not allowed in the monumentation era through the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association rules to depict specific individuals. So Hayes was not allowed to be featured there. But we can see
that's how we end up with Bong Tinson on top of the Pennsylvania, because it's not strong. It's not strong. That's Bong Tinson. It's a different guy.
It's a different guy. It bears a strong resemblance.
Yes, a strong. Don't say it. It doesn't bear a strong resemblance. Bad joke.
As many times as I think I've said that line many times, didn't even realize I was making a pun there.
Yes. Now you will never unpun it, and now you got to lean into it, Cody. You got to lean into the dad jokes.
But But Hayes, relatively soon before the Gettysburg campaign, in that winter of 62 into 63, is when he'll get his new assignment as a brigade command, and it turns into a division command in the 2nd Corps. That was ended up being probably 10 minutes of my 30-second introduction of Hayes into the war there. But
context is everything.
Yeah,
dude.
there's a lot of context.
You're good
there.
with it. Just lay it out. So.
Yeah.
So he is a guy who is not afraid to let you know how he feels. He's also not afraid to go after the things he believes in, which I respect. It's hard to stand on your principles, and it seems like he's super confident with where he is on things. I wonder how infuriating that can be to go through the experience just of like, I've seen this war, I understand this war. How dare you have the opinion you have? You know shit. You're sitting at home. You know nothing. Like, you know nothing. It's completely unrelated, but I was thinking, Matt, you just brought up like almost all wars experiences. During the First World War, the Tommies come home when the war is over, and the rest of England's like, all right, the war's over. Like, get on with it. They just didn't understand, and like a lot of people were resentful of that. So I wonder if his resentfulness of this traitors on the home front translates into aggressiveness on the battlefield, like if there's a directness to that. If I can't directly take it out on the people at home, I wonder if I can inflict it on the enemy that is causing this whole beef to begin with. Like, I don't know. It sounds like he's already got a track record of kind of being aggressive, definitely competent.
Right.
And he's going to show that continuously. So I just wonder if there's a F around and find out kind of, he got wounded, so they've now F'd around. People at home are F'ing around, and now everybody in front of Alexander Hayes is about to find out. And especially in this grand moment.
Yeah. And I think when we look at his wound, it'll impact his already ill health that I mentioned. So you have this aspect of it as well, where, this already ill man, unexplained, frequent illnesses throughout his life, and then all of a sudden he suffers a grievous wound, forces him to go home. He doesn't really want to be off that front line. We've already seen how he wanted to be in the war. Now the rebels have basically taken that away from him. I think he's seeing that. He loses like 50 pounds when he goes home, goes through these bouts of blindness.
I wonder if him and AP Hill drink from the same well. Just constant sickliness.
Yeah. All of that, combined with this feeling toward these traitors on the home front, and he does, in his writings, we can see that he's almost wanting that opportunity for that F around and find out, why don't you invade Pennsylvania? Go ahead and invade Pennsylvania. Let's see. Yeah.
With your research, Cody, it doesn't sound it definitely sounds like he's not a Republican, but it also sounds like he has concerns about the Democrats. Does he express any real political leanings one way or the other?
Here's a good couple of examples here. So I don't know what party, if any, he is officially affiliated with or registered to. I've never determined that. I wonder. I don't know.
And maybe he wasn't.
Yeah, he might not have been. But this gives you a sense of how he's. By modern terms, we'd call this a flip-flopper. I think in 19th century context, I think we can see that he's clearly evolving.
Sure.
He's one of those people, much like Lincoln, who, has one opinion and will evolve into the other. And once he has the rationale for why he's changed that opinion, he's not going to go back.
He's going to just latch on.
Exactly. So this just gives you a few examples here. So I mentioned the point about wishing that Camp Curtin was named in memory of Curtin. So that gives you a sense right off the bat of how he feels about at least the chief Republican in Pennsylvania. He'll say of McClellan, this is in April 1862, "We have no distrust of George's ability to carry us through. I hope he will not be embarrassed by any political scheme. He has more at stake than any other person." The following month, Hayes said, "All have confidence in our General McClellan, and I believe we have his." A couple months later, he said, "Confidence in General McClellan is high. Enthusiasm for him now as he rides along the lines amounts to wildness." In August 1862, "We are still for little McClellan, and the people must not throw him overboard without cause." So there I think we can start to see that there's a bit of a pivot.
That's August 62?
August 62.
We're coming off the peninsula.
Yep, exactly. Yep. So we can see the pivot from everyone loves McClellan, including me, to I still like McClellan. I hope others will as well. But you can see that there's the writing on the wall, that there's a reason now to
That's what
to have
happens
some
when you
distrust.
go on to Richmond and then back to Washington.
He antagonizes.
was ordered back to
I
Washington.
Listen, I know. I'm just making a joke. Listen, we do a fair amount of defending McClellan on this show. The one time I kind of throw shade, you got to cut me off. Like that just cements our apologist standpoint at this point. With 4.5 seasons, we have danced around the fact that we have become McClellan apologists in certain contexts. But right there, Matt just cemented it. We're done. We're officially. Apparently, we love Little Macs and Big Macs here on our show. Anyway, speaking of which, lunch today? Big Macs? Big Macs? Big Macs. All right, great. Anyway, let's just move on from lunch. Move on.
That's all right. But along those same lines, he'll antagonize. This is, I think, in September of 62. I forget if it's right before or right after Antietam. But he antagonizes what he calls the enemies of Little Mac. And then he proffers the refrain, "Hurrah for Mac," to close out one of his letters. So all pro-McClellan, realizes people around him are starting to turn, but he himself is not willing to do that. Now we have the Hayes who has been sitting at home, traveling through Pennsylvania, seeing that, traitors on the home front, as he called them. And we start to see that right around Christmas 1862. So post Fredericksburg, of course, McClellan's no longer in command. Now we start to see Hayes makes a big pivot toward anti-McClellan sentiment. December 26th, 1862, McClellanism is very weak, he writes. Late May 63, after Chancellorsville. McClellan's intercourse of late with Copperheads is damning him in the estimation of his old friends. The glorious prestige of which his name conferred upon our troops would wane if McClellan is associated with treason and mockery. So he's using big terms now to define the people that McClellan. Yes, he did. He did.
He used it in a non-naughty way too, so he's serious.
He used it in the same sentiment as treason and mockery.
That's right, dude. He's going hard. I also found it interesting. I didn't really realize. So he misses the Antietam and Fredericksburg campaigns with the army. So he sees those through the newspapers and through letters.
Yes.
That has got to be heart-wrenching to know what those men are going through. And
then the nadir of the army that winter, 62 into 63.
Yep, just especially for a guy who is very much a doer, So I didn't even think about that until we sort of just all summed that right there. It's like, oh wow, he misses.
Yeah,
he let her spectates essentially. So
and he writes about when they, and this is and you and I have talked about this before, Matt, about soldiers during the Monocacy campaign, writing about being on or around the Antietam battlefield.
Right.
Hayes, even though he did not fight at Antietam, when his forces are in that general vicinity of Sharpsburg, Maryland in 63, he reflects upon that a little bit. He was not a soldier who fought there. If you read between the lines, I think we could, not to psychoanalyze him, but I think we can see there's a little lament there, basically, a little bit of guilt.
Because the 63rd fights there, right? No? Or are they part of... Because a lot of Pennsylvania forces are called home during Antietam, I think.
Well, Governor Curtin wanted all Pennsylvania forces called home.
Well, I know that's the reason John Reynolds isn't there. Because Reynolds is, I think, directly called home to take command of the local forces. So I knew that one, but I guess... You know what? It's been so long since we did the actual recording with Eric Money where we cover the Pennsylvania reserves in full that I bet you the answer's buried in that one because we haven't done a 4-hour episode in a long time. And guess what, listeners? That's a big monster. But I bet you that's in there. So either way, so he sounds, a lament would make sense for a guy that, understands the gravity of all this, wasn't able to take part in it. I can't relate personally, never been to war, but I've missed big things that other people got to positively and negatively experience. So I think on a human level, you can relate to that to a certain extent. So what time?
Fortunately for the 63rd, they were back in the defenses of Washington.
So they were still, okay. So
they're at Chantilly, interestingly enough. So they're part of that whole saving the bacon of the Army of Virginia. Okay. But they will be back in the defenses of Washington during the actual Maryland campaign.
All right, very cool. At what point does Hayes rejoin the Army? So you said he even misses Chancellorsville. So we are coming right upon the Gettysburg campaign.
Yep.
Chancellorsville, obviously haven't covered it on this show, but the most worthless Confederate victory in the entire war. I'll just say this. Ask yourself this. What does Lee accomplish?
I think Lee would agree with you.
No, that's my point. We'll get into it on that episode whenever we do that. But, if we're going to talk about it, let's just call it what it is. Great newspaper headline. You lost a lot. We'll get into that one on another day of the History Things podcast. That was my advertisement voice. There'll be echo, like the monster trucks. Parker, we can do that in post, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. When does he rejoin the Army, Cody?
So it'll be winter 63, so right at the start of 62, or end of 62 and the beginning of 63. I think it's around January, February, that he'll take up a brigade in the 22nd Corps around the defenses of Washington. And in the course of research as well, just to tie my interest in this story to my day job, one of the units that's in the defenses of Washington at this time is the 151st Pennsylvania, which will suffer
the 151.
The 151, the school teachers regiment.
Different war, guys. Don't no shell shock.
Yes, the school teachers
and George McFarland, who will ultimately be the longest tenured patient at the Seminary Hospital, where Seminary Ridge Museum is today. He'll write a lot about how much he respects Hayes. The chaplain of the 151st Pennsylvania will write about this kind of hardened temper of Alexander Hayes, where it's this mix between this kind of playful, jocular side, but then also this really tightened, formal Army officer. And he has this line, I don't have it in front of me, where he expands upon that a little bit, and we can see both of those sides that we've talked about of Hayes to this point. But nevertheless, it'll be right before the start of the Gettysburg campaign. Hayes is going to receive what was William French's old division in the Second Corps. And that's what he'll take command of on the road to Gettysburg. So you have a new Corps commander in Winfield Scott Hancock of the Second Corps, and now a new division commander within that corps. Of course, Hayes will join John Gibbon and I'm just blanking on who's the other division commander.
That's the guy over me in terms of Army structure. I'm definitely not the Army structure guy.
At Gettysburg, thanks for putting me on the spot.
Sorry,
I can edit all this down. I'm not worried about it, but let's see if we can come up with this
I
answer.
just had it right on.
I'll do the Jeopardy.
Yeah. This is normally right on the classic case of
tip of the
common knowledge that I have, and suddenly just
that's what happens. Guys like us have so much data. Like when I do intern for people, like at my job, and like sometimes like the wires that aren't meant to touch. I just tell people, it's like, you guys would never believe how much data I have in my brain that just constantly, like, my brain is the screen from the Matrix, just coding French and Indian War, American Revolution, American Civil War, Civilian Conservation Corps, this family, this soldier, this diary, Joseph Plum Martin, Loudon's Letters to Bouquet, like, it never ends.
So, Second Corps, Army of the Potomac, 1st Division is John Caldwell.
There we go.
Brigadier General John Caldwell, which we should have known from Antietam.
Yeah.
Then, of course, we've got John Gibbon, our boy, and then Alexander Hayes with 3rd Division.
That's right.
So fantastic.
Thank you for finishing my thought there.
We just disrespected Caldwell so hard. They were like, what's that guy's? Oh, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of folks who disrespect Caldwell, but that's a story for another day.
Where are we? Are we pro Caldwell, or are we just...
I don't have the beef with Caldwell that many people have. There's some aspersions upon his bravery and things like that. So, yeah, we don't need to get into that now.
So then we can't take an official stance until we've actually looked at it, because we're not into cowards here. It's like, I'm the biggest coward ever.
Before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this story, you made a comment, Cody, about your personal research touching on your work research. Mm-hmm. And gentlemen, how much do we love that when we can actually at work doing work things and still be getting the bits we need for our own research. It is one of the it's one of the best things.
It is. It is really fulfilling, where these people who, in your mind are existing in slightly different worlds,
right?
And then all of a sudden the people, the event, whatever it might be, they mesh together. Yep. And it just adds a little bit of context then to All right, so this guy, George McFarland, who spends 2.5 months in the building, that I work in.
Wow.
He had, for some amount of time in the winter of 1863, personal interaction with this guy who I've spent, hundreds of hours, perhaps, spending time reading his words and words about him, and they knew each other, and in some small way, and that it's just kind of a fascinating little.
We just had that recently here on the show. What did we come across? Oh, Willie the Deuce. We came across this recently with Willie the Deuce and Backy Ismay. So we have turned essentially two historical figures that we've covered on this show into sort of caricature jokes because they're sensational people that, did. I'm not going to describe them. They were epic people. Positively, negatively, we'll get
in their
that
time.
later. But
epic people in their time.
We don't even refer to them by anything other than their nicknames at this point. Kaiser Wilhelm II, we just call him Willie the Deuce. That pisses off one guy who listens to our show pretty royally, but continues to listen. So thanks, dude, for your support. And then Backy Ismay, real life nickname for Thomas Ismay, the guy who creates the modern version of the White Star Line, subsequently later Titanic, things like that. And at one point, when Backy Ismay dies, he is being viewed as one of the most revolutionary minds in the shipping industry at the time. And Willie the Deuce sends a personal note of condolence to his widow. And we were like, Willie the Deuce is commenting on the death of Backy Ismay. Nobody cared. I told my wife this in the kitchen. She was like, I don't give a shit at all. But I was like, great. I'm texting Matt. I'm texting Parker. We're all like, oh, my God. So good.
History nerding.
But that's what it is. You're not, it's like when the wires cross.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Hayes, McFarland, like for you, Codie's head explodes. Thanks for putting it back together to come on our show.
You bet.
But, that's what makes your mind go everywhere. That's pretty cool.
It does. Yeah, it is.
Willie the Deuce, everybody. Go back and listen to the year-end episode from season 3 and have a good time. Have a good time. All right, so let's get into the story itself.
Yep.
He's moving with the 151 now, or I guess I'm sorry, I got confused because there's been many units. So he is a brigade commander now.
He was a brigade commander in the
now he's a division.
winter.
Now he's back to division. All right, so he's up to division commander now. Are we moving to the Gettysburg campaign? Are we still along the way? Where are we at in this? Because this story is wild, much wilder than I was anticipating. I thought it would be like, so here's his roll call. Boom, let's go to Gettysburg. But I committed my own sin. There is context and a war and a career that happened. So are we immediately at the doorstep of the Gettysburg campaign now, or are we still sort of getting there out of the winter?
Yeah, it's in that post Chancellorsville period that he's promoted to division command, and he'll be with the division pretty much on their entire march from into Pennsylvania. Not a whole lot of big takeaway there, other than the fact that he'll cross over the ground where he was wounded, or in that general proximity on the Second Bull Run, Second Manassas battlefield. And,
does he reflect on that?
He does a little bit, yeah. He or at least the soldiers around him do. So he'll write on June 20th about marching 20 miles, including over the Bull Run battleground, and that's pretty much the only mention that he makes of it. But soldiers in his division will have a bit more reflection on what it meant to them to cross over this ground and to see some of the locals there. Soldier in the 108th New York will say the sight was sickening. The bones of our men, with fragments of clothing, lay upon the ground, having never seen a shovel full of dirt thrown upon their remains. In one place were the bones and skulls of 10 men. Along the path we pursued for a mile were the exposed remains of dead soldiers. So they're reflecting upon the fact they can see the bones of their own men, and that will rub some of them the wrong way. Numerous graves, this is the same soldier, of rebel soldiers were to be seen well put under and marked. In one or two places, pieces of tin were nailed upon trees with the sympathetic appeal, please don't disturb these remains. But he countered, saying in his account, this was a plea from barbarians.
I think I got to go to the bathroom real quick here, fellas. I'm going to fall out of line real fast.
They'll not quite that, but they will see.
Going to water the tree real suddenly.
They will see that nearby there's an old church in a grove. He wrote, school was in progress, and upon our approach being discovered, the children fled like frightened chickens. So they scare this innocent group of children who are at school by sneaking up upon this church where school is in progress. But while that's not from Hayes himself, I think it's noteworthy that the soldiers within his division are expressing some of these same sort of frustrations, perhaps, that Hayes is about the war. Like, oh, those lousy rebels couldn't even bury our guys, men. Yeah. Meanwhile, theirs are under well-marked graves. So, and I'm sure there's probably plenty of that happens, in both sides through the course of the war. One example here during the Gettysburg campaign that I think is noteworthy. But yeah, Hayes himself doesn't reflect a ton upon, that march into Pennsylvania. He has a great line on June 30th. He writes to his wife, "We have a promise of a fight. My command will do its duty." And so that's kind of the last remark we have from him as they're about to enter Pennsylvania, June 30th, and they'll get into the Gettysburg area proper late July 1st, early July 2nd.
It's probably best he didn't write anything about seeing his old wounding spot, because it probably would have been like, see that rock right over yonder? That's where they shot me. Bastards. They're going to get it. And then he'd probably just go do it. He'd probably not much to talk about. He seems like more of a doer and less of a talker at this moment in the war. He's very anxious, I think. I don't know if anxious is maybe the right word, but he seems very eager to get back into not just a command because he's here, but like he seems ready to get re-engaged. Like he's ready for the enemy to get in front of him, I think.
He is, yeah. And we'll see post Gettysburg, he takes a moment to step back, and he's a bit reflective and
maybe a little too eager.
I don't know if too eager is the right term, but because he performs as well as any division commander at Gettysburg does, and we see that laudation coming from superiors, from officers and soldiers under him. But he does certainly take a step back on what this all means in the aftermath of Gettysburg, and I think that flag incident is maybe how he takes that out physically, tangibly. But then he also takes a moment, even in his official report, to talk about. He talks about seeing the moments right after Pickett's charge where he says something along the lines of, "The angel of death alone could present such a scene as what transpired in front of us." One of those rare examples of that sort of poetic twist on an official report. It's not just the military jargon coming out there, but rather this sort of a reflective mood that we can see there of not just the hardened warrior, not just the bombastic commander, but taking a moment to consider, like, oh, this is a pretty dramatic event that we are all in the midst of right now.
And a horrible event.
And a horrible event. Yeah.
All right, well, let's briefly touch on the battle part of his experience at Gettysburg, just so we can set some context for how he gets to where he is the moment he picks up the flags. I know we've already kind of covered what that moment was like, and we're going to get back into it again. But let's go through his actual fighting at Gettysburg real quick. Like, what is he engaged with? Or not what is he engaged with? It's the enemy. Somebody out there is like, it's the bad guys, duh. Somebody's like, it's not the bad guys. We don't talk like that. I haven't had coffee yet. Can you guys tell I haven't had my coffee yet?
Tell.
We're doing a very rare early morning recording here on the podcast. Normally we record somewhere in the early afternoon into the evening. We're definitely night owls here at the show. We decided to schedule a big day here, and so we're doing a 9 a.m. recording, and you can tell the coffee has not gone around this room. Mainly me. But on the field, is he engaged July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd? Is he there? Because I know some elements of this army, like the 6th Corps, for instance, don't even arrive until... Is it the 6th Corps I'm thinking of? It's Sedgwick's guys that do a lot of marching between Manchester, Maryland. I think they arrive at the end of the first day, maybe, or something like that. But...
6 Corps in reserve pretty much the whole battle.
But that's what I mean. Like, there are units. They were just because I live local to that story. Armies marching through where I live. So is he there for all 3 days of this battle? Is he engaged only in 2 or 3 of them?
He's engaged July 2nd and July 3rd.
Sweet.
And uniquely, his division... the 3 brigades of his division are divvied across the battlefield. So at almost no one time on July 2nd are they all 3 in the same place, with the exception of their initial arrival. So they'll come up Tawnytown Road into Gettysburg from generally the southeast, They're placed along Cemetery Ridge, the northern side of it. So for those familiar with the Gettysburg battlefield, Hayes's headquarters might have been, this has never been confirmed, but it's been suggested through the years, at the farm of Abraham Bryan.
That's cool.
You're kind of just west of where the old Cyclorama was, where the National Cemetery parking lot is today. Yeah, certainly.
Abraham Bryan got shafted by the feds.
Yes,
here's
he did.
$15 for your farm.
Yep.
The whole thing that got destroyed.
And one thing, along those lines, to add a little context here, Hayes does have at least 2, maybe 3 paid black servants with him. And I've often wondered, is there anything there to suggest to these men, if in fact Hayes's headquarters are at Abraham Bryan's home, are they aware? They're on the farm of a free black man. Is Hayes aware of that? I don't, and I've never seen anything to suggest that anyone is aware of that. But just a moment where you can kind of see some of those pieces of history coming together there.
All I know about Abraham Bryan is that that man's farm got severely jacked up during the fight, and the federal government was like, "Oh, was it the Rebs that destroyed your property? How about no money for the value?" I think they gave him like $15 for a value property of like $1,500 or some the money math of mine might be wrong. It likely is, but I remember that he got practically nothing when he deserved like a total loss kind of coverage situation. But
and that's a common theme with all of the damage claims that are coming about.
Yeah, for the record, I don't think that's directly related to the fact that he is an African American. I think that plays a role in the fact of how much less he might get.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, the feds were very obviously playing, oh, did they ruin it? That sucks. We'll pay for it if we ruined it, but if they ruined it, that sucks. And that happens directly at the place I work. I mean, there is destruction of private property and that everybody's got records of, except for the Union soldiers stationed at the place I work. So weird how there's no official record, right? You got to pay for it if you have receipts.
Another fun tie-in with all 3 of our sites. I think we can all have those stories.
That's right, When they destroy things and don't keep records, it's like, oopsie daisy. So anyway, all right. So his headquarters then would be located. He obviously wouldn't be keeping that as his headquarters on July 3rd, would he? I mean, that's right in the middle of the fight.
Yeah, it might have been, and that gets into, not to jump all over the place here, but that gets into a controversy later, decades later, over where his statue is located.
Right.
Erected by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in the 19-teens, but it's not dedicated at that time until, ultimately not until 1982. The First World War is going to delay the dedication of several Pennsylvania monuments, including Hayes's. And David Shields, this key player in our story, he wanted a couple of things with Hayes' statue that he'll petition the federal government, the War Department. Hayes or Shields even lives long enough to experience interacting with the National Park Service. He'll die in the 1930s. But
that's so crazy.
It really is.
We're not that far removed.
He's
from
buried
all this.
among World War II veterans at Gettysburg National Cemetery.
So wild.
That is wild.
But he points out 2 things that he doesn't like about Hayes' statue. One is that it doesn't feature a painting we'll talk about in a little bit here depicting the flag dragging incident. He wants this painting to be there as a bas-relief. And secondly, to the point we're talking about now, the location of the statue is well further north. So if you turn off of Emmitsburg Road today onto I don't even know if it formally has a name, but the little avenue between Steinmore Avenue and the National Cemetery parking lot, pretty much the first monument, certainly the first statue that you'll see is Hayes's, and that's pretty much the defense that the battlefield folks are going to have. Is historically, when you entered Gettysburg National Military Park via the Hancock Avenue entrance along Baltimore Pike, right across from the Tawnytown Road, right across from the National Cemetery, they wanted to have a statue as the first thing people would see. And so that would be the Hayes statue. And Shields says, while that may be the case, it's nowhere near the center of his division. It's nowhere near where I know him to have been as his aide on this battlefield. And so that kind of gets into why we don't know for certain where Hayes' headquarters were. Were they at the Bryan farm? Were they somewhere, in that general vicinity? But, nevertheless, regardless of where he's keeping his headquarters, he's an active commander. He's moving about. And as I alluded to a bit ago, all 3 of his brigades are in totally separate positions throughout July 2nd, especially. We'll have Samuel Carroll's, George Willard's brigade, these Harper's Ferry Cowards, as they're known derogatively for having been at the surrender of Harper's Ferry in the Maryland campaign of 1862. They're sent toward the southern end of Cemetery Ridge after Dan Sickles' Third Corps has moved to the west, opening up that big gap in the Union line. And ultimately, Willard's brigade will have what we now refer to often as the redemption of the Harper's Ferry cowards.
Right.
Hayes is appreciative of the losses that these men have suffered in doing what they did July 2nd, writing in his official report, the history of this brigade's operations is written in blood. Talks about how one half of the casualties in his whole division came from this one brigade alone, and then will likewise reflect upon how, in his words, the acts of traitors at Harper's Ferry had not tainted these men's patriotism. So realizing
so
that they've
throwing
been
the
able
officers under the bus for Harper's Ferry, but not the men in the rank.
I think so, and this is another way. There are several things with Hayes you can interpret in a couple of different ways. Is he talking about the acts of the traitors who captured these men, the literal
the
rebels,
Confederates,
or like you said, Pat, is he throwing officers under the bus? Is he calling these officers traitors?
I feel like it's got to be an in-house slight because there's people are very critical of Dixon Miles and his lack of response and his quite literal execution of the command, right? To defend the town is what Dixon Miles is charged with in 1862, and he does that. That's why he doesn't move his forces outside of the town itself and Bolivar Heights. I mean, he has an opportunity at one point to go to Maryland Heights, doesn't. Has at one point the opportunity to go secure Loudon Heights, chooses not to, and in fact comments on the fact that it's impossible to drag guns up there. Stonewall Jackson's like, hold my milk, because it's definitely not beer. It's he says hold my lemonade.
Hold my lemonade.
He says John Walker put some guns up there.
Yeah, well, Johnny Walker, because you know how Johnny Walker makes it feel. Well, Johnny Walker comes along and is like, I'll get those guns up there, and he does. But then, it's like, so there's a resentment, I think, for that, because I think even amongst Miles's own subordinate officer corps, there was resentment. So I think that filters out and doesn't go away. The men wanted him to do more there, and I think the fact that that's the largest surrender of U.S. soldiers all the way up until the Second World War, that's not something that people just forget. So I imagine guys like Hayes, who are opinionated, competent, confident, who has already demonstrated that they have opinions on things, and he's also seemingly rational, logical. He's probably like, it's this... He might not have needed to name names at that point because we're pretty far removed, but that incident is obviously command focused. The men in the rank were the men in the ranks, and B, a lot of those guys are super new. Remember, that's a huge part of the Harper's Ferry garrison is like, they're not 100 days men, but some of them had only been in the Army like 100 days. Yeah. I think the 121st New York.
Less than that.
I think the 121st New York, I think, has been in the Army for 3 weeks when it all goes down for them at Harper's Ferry.
There's guys that are in there less than that.
So
we're talking late
Codie,
August.
I don't read that as traitors or whatever, and they're talking about, gray guys. I think that's we had guys on our side that failed our men, and he's critical of that.
And noteworthy that is a line from his official report. So this is a
he's
official.
He's
putting it down.
This is how we feel about it, and that's a real powerful and effective way to do it. It's subtle. It's understated. It's not like. How he's delivered a few middle fingers thus far, and the big one here at this battle. This is a very professional middle finger, I think.
Hayes doesn't strike me as one who would back down from a statement, either written or said. But it's one of
the picture. He's huge.
But
what are you going to do?
It's very much the sort of statement that he could demur very easily. I was referring to the Confederates.
Yes.
Yeah. I also
what else
get
you
the
want to say?
impression that he would do that. I get the impression he'd tell you right away. He's like, "Oh yeah, I'm
well,
talking about you."
Exactly,
if
exactly.
Miles was
That's what I'm
alive,
saying.
He'd be like, "Does that shoe fit, Dixon? Does it? Does it, buddy?" Yeah, I think so far I get the impression that he's that. He's got maybe it's. I joked a minute ago because of how big he is. I mean, maybe he's also got that physical huge confidence. He's like, I'm 100 feet tall. What are you gonna do about it, bro? I wish historical people said bro more.
I don't. I'm so glad.
Could you imagine as we try to transcribe all these letters we do, like after we get through the fact that the handwriting is sometimes super hard to read because they're artists with pens, then it says bro. Today at the front, and you're like, what? That would be so great. Or Lincoln's like, bro, have you taken the fort yet?
I feel so bad for our future colleagues
What's the vote on Fort Fisher?
who will be dealing with that in emails and text message and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
Bro, Afghanistan sucks. Yeah.
LOL.
we talked earlier about made a passing reference to Strong Vincent earlier,
Right.
And Oliver Wilcox Norton's the attack and defense of Little Round Top. I'm sure the context is totally different, and I've probably looked this up and willfully forgot what exactly he meant by it. But the point stands that he refers at one point, Norton does, to Strong Vincent as I quote, a dude and an upstart.
That's fun.
But he uses he calls him a dude.
That's so great, dude. That guy talks like this, man. He's a dude and an upstart. Strong Vincent. And then he passes it to the next commander. You know what? We're joking now, but people are people, and it's funny when you come across these moments because oftentimes through historical writing, you don't get people being people. You get people being very proper and professional.
Informal, yeah.
And you don't get a lot of the short form or like the common tongue type of thing. And when you come across it, it cracks you up. We got it at my site. At one point, there's 4,000 prisoners inside of a fort built for 500 people. And the state of Maryland is asking what's the situation at the fort, and they get a letter back that says it's pretty full. And that's it. It's like, my brain is expecting so much more because of what we do for a living, and it's like, that they just said it. It's pretty full. Cool. All right, but it tickles me. So people are people, guys. We've said it for 4 straight seasons on this show. We're moving into season 5, and people are still going to be people, including us weirdos behind the mic here. So
even in our own, think about it in our own lives, the way we write, even though it's not as formal in most instances as it was at the time, the way we write and the way we speak are 2 totally different things.
That's a really good point.
We don't get that insight into how they're speaking with one another.
I am a
verbally.
much more eloquent writer than I am a speaker.
Having written your work, yes, I would agree with that statement.
So Matt is the only person, there's one other now who has read the book that has been referenced that I've been writing for a while now, and yes, I am a professional at times when I want to be, but the majority of you out there, unfortunately, only get to experience caricature a host of this show, Pat, and that is just go ahead and cue the Wild Thing music. Me and Rick Vaughn just walking in here, messing it up. All right, so people are people. I'm a weirdo. Alexander Hayes is a badass. The Harper's Ferry crew has redeemed themselves. They're shouting Harper's Ferry across the wall, and a whole line of people yelling Fredericksburg. There's a bunch of people screaming Harper's Ferry because they never let go of it. Alexander Hayes respects those guys. Respects the pants right off of them, Matt. He respects their pants right off. So right off. So how do we go from respecting men to, does he just feel this moment? Is this a guy who's recognizing not just the magnitude of the moment of victory, but he recognized the moment of somebody needs to do something grand here to just further ice this cake. Mm-hmm. Is he realizing that, or does he just kind of get swept up in it?
Spur of the moment.
Is he swept up in it, or does he recognize it as it happens?
I've seen nothing to suggest that he has contemplated this or has any precedent for performing this flag act.
If we win, I'm going to do this.
I've seen nothing to suggest that. No one around him mentions this is the plan. This was what he's talking about for 6 months. He finally saw the opportunity. We don't see that. Okay. We see Willard's brigade, do what they do on Southern Cemetery Ridge, July 2nd. Samuel Carroll's brigade is over on East Cemetery Hill. Thomas Smith's brigade then is going to be involved in the burning of the Bliss farm. So we have these varied places on the battlefield where Hayes' division is. They're brought back together on Northern Cemetery Ridge, facing west, on the right end of the famous angle, on the right end of the Philadelphia brigade. They'll be basically right up against Pettigrew's brigade along the northern portion of Pickett's charge. And ultimately, during the course of the attack itself, of course, there's the bombardment preceding it. And then during the attack itself, Hayes is literally shouting the manual of arms to his men, trying to be that presence who is this is
like the loading and the 9 times commands.
He's shouting to these men, he is reading from the manual of arms, reminding them of what you're witnessing right now. May feel overwhelming, but don't forget what you're doing here.
He's trying to keep him steady, keep him in the moment.
Exactly.
He's got the manual out?
That's what it sounds like. Yeah, I don't know if I have that account in front of me here, but there are at least a handful of guys who mention he's basically performing drill as we're in the middle of this most famous attack, perhaps, of the Civil War.
Yo, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
That's also like cool, like Jimmy Dean cool. Like that's like, I mean, you got to have a steady hand for that one.
No joke.
Pretend it's not real, but sir, it is super real right now. Pretend it's not. Like Jesus.
And then his,
Whack. You know, I mean, it's real.
Yeah, exactly. His thoughts then on what he witnessed. This is what he witnessed as far as the charge itself. So this is written within a couple of days of the battle in the form of both his official report, letters home to his wife, as well as his father-in-law, who he corresponds with quite a lot. Doesn't make any mention of what he does, after this all happens. Maybe has kind of a passing allusion to it, as we'll see. But he mentions after the bombardment ceased, a heavy column of the enemy formed in 3 lines, preceded by a line of skirmishers, debouched from the wood opposite our lines. Their march was as steady as if impelled by machinery. I think that's a great line. Unbroken by our artillery, which played upon them a storm of missiles. When within 100 yards of our infantry, the fire of our men could no longer be restrained. 4 lines rose from behind our stone wall, and before the smoke of our first volley had cleared away, the enemy, in dismay and consternation, were seeking safety in flight. Every attempt by their officers to rally them was in vain. In less time than I can recount it, they were throwing away their arms and appealing most piteously for mercy. The angel of death alone can produce such a field as was presented. So all of that is in his official report.
That's a hell of a write-up.
100 yards.
4 lines of infantry at 100 yards. F that.
Dude,
Jesus.
Just for context, once upon a time we had to get that close or closer because the weapons dictated that.
Yep.
Smoothbore weaponry, training your soldiers to be accurate consistently between 60 and 80 yards. You're going to stretch that to ranges of 100 yards. So we're talking American Revolution, French and Indian War. These guys are getting right up on each other. Mexican War, getting right up on each other. 1812, right up on each other because the weapons say you have to do this to fight.
Yep.
The Civil War, we've got rifles almost in every hand. Ranges of 200 to 300, 400 yards, deadly at 1,000. I mean, you're not really aiming at specific targets at 1,000, but definitely deadly at 1,000 yards. And yet, here's another instance into the fat part of this war where we are still allowing or using close-range infantry tactics. Think about how devastating. Because I often go to this fight at Second Manassas, right? Stonewall Brigade coming up against what will become the Iron Brigade very shortly. They're basically already the Iron Brigade. And I always argue this is where they really should become the Iron Brigade because they stand there and they punch the Stonewall Brigade in the mouth for 2 straight hours without blinking, and the sun quits the fight. Nobody else, like, I don't understand South Mountain, how you don't have that nickname before you get to South Mountain. But anyway, that's an 80-yard fight, and that's brutal. I mean, here you're at 100 yards. First of all, you've eaten all of that federal artillery. There's not too many times where I get very sympathetic. It's sort of like, oh man, to the Confederate soldier. There are times where I will acknowledge in a human sense that the war sucks for everybody involved, even the common fighting soldier on the Confederate side.
I got to admit, when you were reading that report, Cody, and he's saying how the artillery is undiminishing their lines, all I'm thinking of is Henry Jackson Hunt going, "Oh, what now?
What?
Excuse me?"
They are eating so much artillery, and they're moving through it. I love that, impelled by machinery. What a visual! Like it's unceasing. It's coming like this wave, and then what breaks a wave? The shoreline. Well, guess what? The shoreline of Federal infantry stood up at 100 yards, and just what a volley experience! Add it to the list of things I would love to see and both not want to see. In the macabre sense, you want to see these grand things, but I really wouldn't like to see that because that probably was a shower of lead. Inexperience in not too many places in the war.
And it is this sort of representation of this in-your-face combat that is horrifying the European military attaches that are coming over and watching this. The British, the Prussians, the French are absolutely horrified.
They're still doing this. They're still getting up on each other.
They were in range when they stepped out of the woods.
Yep.
And they don't engage until 100 yards. They're like, you got 300-400 yards, 500 yards. Get them. They hold their fire until 100 yards. It is wild.
From a defensive standpoint for the Federal infantry, this makes perfect sense tactically because you have now, from a mostly defended, protected position, allowed the enemy to get completely exposed to the point where there is nowhere for them to go. Because even if they turn around and about face immediate retreat, they now have a mile to go, and you are going to load and reload and just keep pouring it on them. So from that perspective, I get it. But from the Confederate perspective, it's like, why even make that attack? And again, we do this with Scott Hartwig, and we'll do this forever, and we're going to move back to the fact that Hayes just gave us a bit of poetry. I do like how official reports sometimes seem very poetic, and oftentimes I wonder if it's the slant of the officer making the scene look great for them, but this doesn't seem to be necessary in this case because it just... you say it is what it is, right? You say this is what happened, and in his situation here, that would be badass, poetic, epic. So I do enjoy the ones that are able to put a little bit of a polished spin on the writing. It helps me understand. It also makes it feel a little bit more grand.
And I think that, Matt, your point about Henry Hunt would question, really, you don't think our artillery was devastating. So I think my first thought there is, on one hand, perhaps it's a bit of what Pat was just saying, where Hayes is trying to make his division's role sound a bit better. But on the other side of that, even we know what role Hunt's artillery was having. We know how devastating that was. But if truly, from Hayes' perspective, he was not seeing that, I think that adds another layer to, even while these Confederate forces are being decimated by the artillery on their front and flank, but they're still coming on in these grand numbers.
That's a fine point.
Then how horrifying, but also we see that in so many Union accounts. How in a weird
grudging admiration.
And there's an admiration there. Yep.
Well, it would be good for the listener to remember at this point, Cody, you're highlighting something that Hayes might not have been able to see this because he might not have had a vantage point X, Y, or Z. For the listener, for us, when we see this battle visually, we see it through the form of 20th and 21st century film and TV.
Oh, sure.
And so we are always seeing it from an elevated platform, a drone flying with the camera. In the case of the famous Gettysburg artillery scene, a literal helicopter, an elevated crane, a painter who can decide wherever his eyes. Every painter is like a 10-foot tall giant looking down on a scene. So we don't actually get to see this. I'm 5'7", I'm 5'9", I'm 6'1", perspective of things. So standing right along the line, is he mounted, by the way? Is he on horseback for the duration of July 3rd?
I think he's on foot for some portion of the defense. I'm pretty sure I've seen at least a couple of accounts talk about him walking behind the lines, but I think for most of this, he's mounted.
All right, well, either way, this is a very big... this is where the armies are among the biggest, if not the biggest, they ever are directly squared off on the battlefield. I'm not an expert at this point, Matt. You can speak better to this, but this is
there's one point when the Confederate Army is larger, but for everybody on the field at once, this is pretty much.
This is like one of the biggest moments of the war. I doubt you can see it all. The entire battle line, especially when the lines start to move. The simple fact that the Federal line is not a literal straight line.
Right.
There's that whole crooked angle and everything. Yeah. So I think it makes sense for him to say what he says, because from his perspective, he might have seen the lines just move. Maybe the artillery's missing a little more. Or maybe the Confederates, not to give them credit, but they do, close those gaps as they march. They are told.
That's the drill, absolutely.
And they execute it well, and they know what they're doing is kind of sketch. So they're told, get across the field. So... yeah, sketch. Official. The Confederates are sketch. Official stance of the History of Things podcast. If you didn't know it by now, the Confederates were sketchy. Sketchy at best.
Jeez. I think that is actually a great segue. Your point, Pat, that you made a moment ago about the relative lack of information that Hayes has in the grand scheme, but. Right. There's a couple of points that I think are fascinating that he does know on July 4th. So that official report, I think, is July 7th that I just read from. July 4th, so just the day after the battle, he's writing letters home to his wife, Annie, and her father, John McFadden. And he'll say, yesterday was a warm one for us. The fight of my division was a perfect success. We are all sanguine of ridding our soil of the invaders. So we can see that, that motivation there, rid the soil of the invaders. But
our soil.
This is
a Pennsylvanian talking. This isn't an American right now. This is a Pennsylvanian.
Fights well on his own dunghill.
But then he does add, information he has that this quickly. Opposed to me were A.P. Hill and George Pickett, besides several others of my old acquaintances. They thought they seemed to think they were attacking raw militia. After cannonading us for an hour, they advanced across the plain. We were met behind our stone wall by a volley, which swept them like a tornado. So he knows who's in front of him. He knows that there's A.P. Hill in one division and George Pickett in another division, or A.P. Hill in corps, George Pickett in division. He knows, these are people I know whose men are attacking. And the obvious way that he probably knows this are Confederate soldiers who have been captured. He's aware of who's in front of him. But he makes several of those really important connections. It's a microcosm moment of a decisive battle of the war. He uses those terms, realizes that, in that moment, knows who he's up against, that they were old acquaintances of his. Rid the soil of the invaders. We've accomplished that mission. So he's piecing together so many of these things where the war is personal, the war is devastating, the war is decisive, and all of these thoughts, flowing through his mind at the same time, being on Pennsylvania soil. I think that somewhere within all of those lies our answer of what drives him to drag flags. It's that combination of a national moment meeting a really personal moment on his home soil.
You just keep adding fuel to this adds emotion, this heightens emotion, that heightens emotion, and it just keeps building, and then boom.
Yep.
I can relate to that a bit. Not like I've done anything that cool in my entire life, but I've done some cool stuff, eh? So in writing about that moment, does it show up in his official report? I mean, does he play it down? Does he celebrate it? The newspapers, his men. Let's talk about Johnny Reb. I mean, there's thousands of Johnny Reb in the area, both slinking off the field and not committed that are watching from
or being
the tree
pulled
lines.
into the lines as POWs.
That's right, yeah. So also real quick, when you talked about knowing who's in front of them, I loved that part of the episode with Hartwig was just talking about how the interrogation of the prisoners is one of the greatest intelligence operations of the war. Just how they knew so much just because of who they captured and things like that. So. What does this look like? This. Okay, so he recognizes the moment. It seems like he seizes the moment. No pre-planning, but he definitely feels the swell of this national moment. He feels the swell of this "get out of my yard," Pennsylvania thing. I know you personally, so there's got that extra edge. I definitely love dunking on my friends more than I love dunking on strangers. Matt is one of my best friends in life, but he is one of the people I love to absolutely needle the most. I used to feel weird about making him cringe, and now I'm like, I love it. It's one of my favorite things. Now I just wonder where the line is. I'm looking for the line to not cross, but I definitely, when you get to sort of tease and compete, and in this case, sometimes fight your friends. It'll add things to it. Matt, I don't want to fight you. I love you, guy. But, I can relate to the personal nature of that. So moving into the memory of it immediately, where do you start? Do you like to look at what his men have to say about it, what he and his writings, his officers? Do you like to go across the battlefield? You said Lee doesn't personally witness this, but he hears about it from his subordinates?
Or he likely witnesses it.
He likely personally witnesses it.
He doesn't write about witnessing it, but there are others around him who do. Where I like to jump into this is with what Hayes doesn't say. So this is July 13th. So this is what he writes about rebel forces and the flags. He says, our prisoners outnumber us 2-1, which is crazy when you really consider that, how many men they capture. I have sent forward to headquarters 17 of the enemy's standards and know of at least 5 others which were surreptitiously disposed of. Such a capture of flags was never known before. I think that's his way of not admitting to disposing of these flags himself. That, in some accounts, as we'll see, each of these officers, Hayes and Courts and Shields, each took 1 flag. Others, they say he also tied one to the tail of his horse. One of them he tramples intentionally under the foot of his horse. So I think Hayes says, I can account for 17 flags. I know of at least 5 others that we captured, but they're not here.
I like that he chose the word surreptitious. It's like, by the way, we did this thing super publicly.
Yeah.
Very publicly. What did it do? Whatever happened to him must have happened very quietly.
Yeah.
I have no clue.
Darndest thing.
I also wonder if potentially he's talking about some of those flags got packed away and taken home.
Perhaps.
Sure.
Yeah. Certainly a big piece of it.
Chamberlain, not to bring him up, but he takes a flag home and he talks about it. It's in his house, I think, till the day he dies. Minnesota and Virginia to this day are beefing over flags.
Do we have any idea whose flags either got dragged? I know there's the list of the flags that got sent up to meet at headquarters.
Like whose flags were dragged? Do we know that?
Shields will have a full invoice of the flags that include, let me do a quick count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. He lists 14. Hayes listed 17. So he says there were 17, but the official list is 14.
So even more
so even 3 others do disappear. To your question, Matt, I've never been able to determine specifically which flags are actually used in the dragging itself.
I was just curious.
Yeah, it's a great question. There are members of Willard's brigade who, one of the things they'll recall is that they can specifically see that on the battle record listed on some of these flags, they can see Harper's Ferry is listed there, and that's what jumps out to them. And a couple of these veterans will talk about how, in some accounts, Hayes doesn't say anything as he's riding. Others, especially from Willard's brigade, they'll remember him shouting something like, "Remember Harper's Ferry." So that jumps out to these men as like, oh, we were literally, these are literally the rebel forces we may have surrendered to at Harper's Ferry. They were, or at least they were present there. So we can, maybe do a little bit of a process of elimination there of, which of these units that's involved in that portion of the attack were at Harper's Ferry. But yeah, so we have a full listing of what was submitted, what flags were captured. There might have been some as well. There's this whole showdown between Hayes and Alexander Webb, commander of the Philadelphia Brigade, who is no fan of Hayes at all. Even before the Gettysburg campaign, he'll write to his wife talking about how he can't stand Hayes. He's profane. He's bombastic. And then in the immediate aftermath of Pickett's charge, Webb will go to Hayes and say, "You have some flags in your possession that were captured by my brigade." And Hayes responds, according to the eyewitness who overhears this, "Then how in the hell do my men have them?" And so he won't give them back and says, like, "I don't know, we seem to have captured them." Webb as well will come to Hayes probably in that same conversation and say, the number of rebel forces who pass into our lines. We only had a few dozen or something like that. And Hayes will respond something along the lines of, "Well, I didn't have any who entered my lines willingly." And there's a Confederate who he gets to the stone wall, he surrenders. One of Hayes's men will grab his hand, grab his arm, pull him across, and capture him. He gets behind Hayes's line, and the rebel officer says something along the lines of, "Oh, these are all the men you have. I wouldn't have surrendered." And Hayes says, "You're welcome to go back and try it again then if you'd like." Let's go.
Hey, quit talking shit. Just be happy you're here at this point.
Yeah.
War's over for you now. Get out of here.
The ultimate middle finger, though, to rebel forces will be, of course, the flag dragging, but rhetorically, it's this line from Hayes. My favorite line that Hayes will write about his service at Gettysburg. He says, this is in a letter to his father-in-law, "My defenses were like stone walls, and since Jackson is dead, I think I have a claim to his title."
That's also true. I mean, not like he's using it anymore.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the line, the 17th Michigan goes, "Oh, wait a second."
Just for the millionth time, if Jackson was at Gettysburg, he would be stinky because he was dead for like 2 months at that point. So let's move past this dumb rhetorical question, because I could say, what if Neil Armstrong could tell the Wright brothers how to build a friggin' plane? Like, we could do this theoretical crap forever. It's pointless. It serves nothing. Sometimes it's a fun thought exercise, but Jackson at Gettysburg, the Second Corps does, I think, a lot of what Jackson would have done. I think this, if you want to get into that one for a half a second, I mean, Ewell doesn't really act super differently. So this is a stupid question. Moving on. At one point, our producer and I, maybe I will review this video and see if it's worth seeing the light of day. But one point in time, our producer and I did a scientific experiment about what would happen if we did bring Jackson to Gettysburg. And since Jackson, Thomas Jonathan Jackson isn't available for the science experiment, we decided to bring other Jacksons. So Parker and I play guitar, so we brought a Jackson guitar to Gettysburg. Didn't change anything. The Confederates still lost the battle. We brought a $20 bill. We bought lunch with it, but we brought a $20 bill. Andrew Jackson, so Jackson was there. Didn't really change anything. Confederates still lost the battle. We didn't have any paint, so we used ketchup and mustard and a napkin, and we made a Jackson Pollock while eating our lunch in the shade at the peach orchard. We cleaned everything up, we packed out and everything, but that didn't change anything. So we've concluded, at least through that ridiculous science experiment, that Jackson's at Gettysburg changed nothing. But maybe we'll have a hoot and we'll review that, and maybe that can be seen. If not, I just told you the story, so hopefully you can live on that if the video never comes out. Matt, have you seen this video? Do you know the video I'm talking about?
I think so.
All right, we'll see. We'll see. If you guys out there see this video one day, then it all worked out. If not, you know that Matt saw this video and said absolutely not, never again. So you can blame Matt from here on out.
Yes, by all means.
All right, so he obviously leaves out, what happens to these flags. Webb, well, I also get the impression Webb is trying not to be left out, and he realizes in the immediacy that he also probably sees the epicness of this moment, and he's not holding battle flags, and that's going to leave him out of glory and songs and commendations and other accolades that are going to come when the guy sitting next to you is like, I've got 17 flags, dude.
But ultimately, I think the irony there is that Webb will be the man remembered most for it, because he's his defense is right at the center of the line. It's at the angle.
Sure, but maybe his concern, because he's looking for the physical evidence of this. It's great that I can say all these things, but wounds heal. Yeah. Right. Paper says paper, but flags are flags. Sure. Right. So I think maybe in a moment he's like, this guy's holding all of these flags. Like, give me some. Yeah. Like, for real, give me some. All right. So across the field, is that where we go next? How is this viewed across the field? I don't know, Cody. This is your show.
Yeah.
You're the expert on Alexander Hayes until you finish the story, and then now we're the experts.
There you go. Yeah, I'll impart all of the information.
This is the Thunderdome. We're just downloading your story and moving on with it.
So what I'll do here is I'll just kind of go through a series of accounts. The first one I'm going to do is out of chronology, only to give people a sense of where this happened. David Shields, in his 1919 account, he lays it out. He gives us the exact path. You can go walk this path if you want to.
That'd be kind of fun.
The exact sense of where it occurred, and I've drawn a crude drawing of a map.
We're going to meet you in Gettysburg, and we're going to walk this path together.
Perfect. Yeah.
Awesome. Video. Some hobby horses.
That'd be cool.
Oh yeah. Let's get some horses.
There we go. Yeah.
And some flags. Yeah. Do a reenactment that makes sense in Gettysburg compared to some of the other ones that don't make sense in Gettysburg. Another day. All right, go ahead.
So Shields, this is how he explains. And for those of you who are familiar with this portion of Cemetery Ridge, maybe you can get kind of a mental map. We're basically along if you can picture the angle, you have the east-west running portion of the stone wall, juts back towards Cemetery Ridge, and then it cuts back north. And that's the left end of this, the 14th Connecticut. The right end of this, near the 111th New York, would be that the statue just kind of right in the middle of the Bryan Farm, basically. For those who listen to Addressing Gettysburg podcast, the logo of Addressing Gettysburg, that logo is that monument. Kind of a symbolic one. But that's the parameters, the left flank and right flank of this attack. So this is what Shields says. In the rear of our division line, to the right flank of the 111th New York, then down the whole front of the division, turning at the left of the 14th Connecticut, and then to the place of the beginning, the men of the 3rd Division throwing their caps high in the air as we rode along, cheering lustily in their exuberance. So we have intercourse and now cheering lustily.
Yes, dude, let's go. Do we need to turn the lights down for this episode? Like, I've asked this on other ones, but maybe now we got to turn the show lights down.
Where was I? Cheering lustily in their exuberance.
Yeah, we were cheering lustily.
Showing their admiration for their glorious division commander. Some men dancing in their the delirium of their joy. Others hugging their comrades in close embrace, wild with the exultation of victory. Shields called this the grandest ride men ever took. There were times when we had to weave in and out in our course to avoid running over wounded rebels and even prisoners still coming in and going to our rear. So that gives you a sense of where this was and what it looked like from a participant who was involved in it.
And the immediacy of it, it's like still going on.
Still going on. Still wounded
The tide
soldiers.
is receding.
Yeah.
There's probably muskets still rattling along the line in places.
Probably,
Like
yeah.
I would imagine that this is not a fight that has completely ceased yet. So this is a very raw.
And I think
moment.
that's I think there's something to that moment where this would have had an impact certainly among Union soldiers if it had happened a little while later that evening or something like that. But when you literally still have the enemy, executing their battle plan, maybe now receding from it, but still, for all intents and purposes, in the midst of
everyone's up. I mean, dude, I'm up. Anytime I hear this story, I'm up. It's been 160 years. I mean, in this moment, oh my God.
Yep.
Probably through the roof. Soldiers probably carried that for the rest of the war in some capacity. Like, I wonder in terms of inspiration, you always get to these parts where you get into the real hot summer campaign months and you'll start to see the desertion numbers kind of go up because the experience sucks entirely, not just because of the fighting, because of the marching, camp conditions, like
Or
all
the
that.
deep
The army's
winters.
on the move. Yeah. So I wonder if that's what effect that has on maybe the guy who's got that in his brain. And then suddenly you put this under your belt with that sort of cherry on top and you're like, you know what? I'm back. I'm in. Like, I'm all in. I wonder what the inspirational effect of this was. You talk about the fact that Fredericksburg hung around when they say this across the line. Harper's Ferry hangs around. They're screaming this across the line. Like, I wonder, even after Hayes' death in 65 at Appomattox, I wonder if things like this were on people's brain at the very end of this war. Is like, this is a moment, and people seem to recognize it. And I just think, me, dumb old Irishman that I am, standing in the ranks, if I saw somebody, if I was a part of this moment with a half a brain and kind of recognized, well, that was big, we just punched them in the mouth, and then I see my officer class, jucking and jiving with the horses and the flags, I'd be like, oh man, I think I'd flip it. I think I'd just go nuts. I don't know. I might just unload the rest of my cartridge box. I'm so excited. I don't need the air at the enemy. Who knows? But,
There's probably some of that. Yeah.
just going nuts. But, it's a powerful moment. And the Confederate soldiers on the ground, what an experience for those guys.
Yeah.
I imagine the ones getting off the field are not thinking about this too much because their backs are to it and they are worried about getting out of here. But the ones who can't move around too much, the horses just miss them. Maybe the flag gets dragged across.
Probably. I think there's probably a bit of that because if you think about the mechanics of this, and we'll talk about a recreation of this later and how the folks involved in it talk about the difficulty of the mechanics, but you're literally holding the staff of the flag and it's dragging across the ground. That's inevitably going to hit some people, I would think. Yeah.
Just a crazy moment. So do you take this moment and now go to the officers on the other side, or the men's? Like, what is the Confederate soldiers' perspective, both in the immediate vicinity of this and watching from afar? Because you said this is witnessed.
Yep.
So there's got to be some feelings. Somebody has to say something about it. Lee, I guess, doesn't.
But there are, on the battlefield that night, or the Union soldiers, July 3rd, July 4th, will write about this in relatively simple terms, but they note it nevertheless. The first account we have at all is a diary entry on the battlefield on July 3rd. Charles Belknap of the 125th New York. General Hayes trailed one of the rebel flags in the dust amid the cheers of the men. William Warner of the 13th Massachusetts, which is a First Corps regiment in John Robinson's division that has been sent to reserve behind and sort of to the right rear of Hayes's division. He would write that same day, as we came over the brow, the rebel line which had charged was broken. Through the throng of men pushing to the rear, half were rebel prisoners who had thrown down their arms, others were wounded, and troops changing positions. General Hayes, with his hands full of rebel flags, trailing in the dirt, was rushing his horse up and down the line near the house that stands to the left of the grove. And so even that day, people are remembering this slightly differently, where Belknap remembers one flag.
Right.
Warner remembers multiple flags. One of them also mentions that he takes multiple passes. So is he picking up flags as he goes? The next day, July 4th, Chauncey Harris of the 108th New York, letter to his father. Brigadier General Hayes had command of our division. I must say he is the bravest division general I ever saw in the saddle. Most of the time, he was riding up and down the lines in front of us, exhorting the boys to stand fast and fight like men. Shell, shot, nor the bullets of rebels seemed to intimidate him in the least. In fact, he paid not the least attention to them, nor did his staff officers. Once he rode by and said, "Boys, don't let him touch these pieces." And in a few moments, he rode back again, laughing, and sung out, "Hurrah, boys, we're driving them like hell." And he dashed up to the brow of the hill, cheered our skirmishers, driving the rebels before them. Striking his high-spirited steed on the flank with his saber, he dashed down among the rebels, seized the stand of colors, carrying them back, rode at a gallop along the front of our lines, laughing, trailing the rebel flag in the dust. Then it was that cheer after cheer went up for him, entirely drowning the sound of the shells that were passing over us. So that's, the next day, a lengthy account talking about Hayes's performance during the battle itself, but then also, how he is inspiring the men throughout the course of the day, and it all culminates in this moment. So those are the initial Union accounts. Within a few weeks, we start to see some of these are going to be published in newspapers. One from William Judd of the 97th New York. He will compare seeing Hayes to seeing Niagara Falls. He says that this is one of the most impressive things I've ever seen, and I bar not Niagara.
Wow.
Lauren Goodrich of the 14th Connecticut writes a letter to a group of friends talking about all the stands of colors and swords which we had captured. It was a scene of the wildest confusion. Our men were cheering, and our division general, Hayes, riding up and down the lines, dragging a secesh flag after him, cheering up among the men. By the time the excitement was over, shades of evening closed over the scene. And we see many different accounts like that. Details slightly different in terms of the number of flags, whether Hayes was shouting, was he laughing, as some of these men will say. But generally, the same sort of details. The Daily Pittsburgh Gazette is going to publish an account that mentions that the flag was tied to the streaming tail of a horse, being dragged ignominiously in the mud. So that's where we get it, tied to the horse, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. Hayes does have 3 mounts that he'll have during the course of the battle, so his horses are casualties. One, he's going to write back to Gettysburg, to a doctor in Gettysburg who is taking care of his horse in the weeks that follow till it eventually perishes. But Hayes will gather flowers from the battlefield, ultimately the bones of some of his horses he'll send back home to be used for jewelry for the women of his family. And so the horses, I think, are the unsung hero of this moment as well. Without them, the ride wouldn't have taken place.
At some point, we will cover the horses of warfare, and I will weep that entire episode very deeply, very ugly cry, because that is the part of this whole conversation and any subject of war we talk about that just jacks me up. Man, the amount of horses. Horses are so pretty, and we made them do all this shit for thousands of years. Right. So sad, but heroes in an epic way tonight.
The 126th New York is where a lot of the accounts come from Willard's brigade, of mentioning that they could see Harper's Ferry listed as on the battle standards. Then let's move toward the Confederate accounts then, without, I'm not going to read every single one that's here, but a lot of overlapping, a lot of similar sort of details.
The amount you've discovered, though, is fantastic.
Yeah, that's the fascinating thing, is even though some of these accounts are pretty simple, straightforward, 1 or 2 lines, that they felt the need to mention it in their letter, in their diary, in their regimental history, in their memoir. It also just continuously
corroborates the story.
Yes.
It happened. It definitely happened. Everybody talks about it.
Yep. Yeah. Even one, the regimental history of the 126th New York, written by a woman named Arabella Wilson, who, as best I can tell, was not in the camp or behind the lines, didn't witness, but she has a nephew who was in the regiment, killed July 2nd. And she is tasked by the men of the regiment with writing the regimental history. And she has multiple accounts in there from these men. So even when they're compiling the regimental, that's a story that almost all of these individuals feel is necessary to tell this woman, like, hey, be sure to mention that this Hayes flag incident took place. And that's where really we see a lot of those details. Yeah. So where we get into the Army commanders, both of them witnessing this, and we'll move across the field to the Confederate side with this, there's a famous moment in perhaps the most famous eyewitness account by a soldier of the Battle of Gettysburg, Frank Haskell's letter to his brother, an aide to John Gibbon, division commander in the Second Corps, and longest published letter. I think this is still true. Longest published letter in American history. It's like 140 odd pages, something like that.
Yeah,
yep.
It's ridiculous.
He's killed at Cold Harbor the following spring, so it's written within a year of
Had he
of
finished
the battle.
writing the letter at that
He
point?
did, yeah, yeah, he did. So it's just simply called the Battle of Gettysburg. A lot of members of the Philadelphia Brigade, as a side note, will take issue with it. They'll write a response of their own that is not flattering to Haskell's remembrances of the battle. But
Are they bitter about the? I don't know.
Bitter about his treatment, basically,
Okay.
of how the repulse occurred, how he doesn't give the Philadelphia Brigade enough credit. Yeah, you can read both sides of that fully digitized online. But a wonderful account, evocative account. And he mentions this one moment, does Haskell, that after the Confederate line has been repulsed, where he'll be standing next to George Meade, and he says that this damned rebellion will make brutes of us all if it is not soon quelled. He'll refer to the fiery Southern crosses, battle flags of the rebellion, waving defiance at the wall, damned red flags of the rebellion, and treason's flouting rag. So it gives you a sense of how he feels about Confederate flags.
Yeah.
And
Say it like, tell us how you really feel.
exactly. George Meade is going to arrive on the scene with George Meade Jr., captain, who is, of course, Meade's son, serving as an aide. And Meade is going to ask in a sharp, eager voice, says Haskell, "How is it going here?" Meade has a white face, really white face at this moment, says Haskell, and he'll tell Meade, Will Haskell, "I believe, General, the army is repulsed." A new light began to come upon his face of gratified surprise, and he says, "What, is the assault entirely repulsed?" Haskell affirms that it has, and he says, Meade, whose eye had for an instant swept over the field, taking in just a glance of the whole, said, "Thank God." And it's at that moment that we can corroborate another person who's going to approach this scene, and that's
All right.
John Egan, a lieutenant in the 1st U.S. Artillery, Battery I, 1st U.S. Artillery. And he'll ride up and he'll write a letter a couple of years later to George Meade Jr. And he says when General Hayes got over the wall, some of his troops at that point followed him. Your father asked me at that time where General Hayes was. So how I piece this together is Meade has just asked Haskell, what's going on here? Haskell says, the line's been repulsed. Meade
Right.
says, thank God. And then he asks, where's General Hayes? Because he must be right along Hayes' line there. And doesn't see Hayes, directly with his men. And Egan says, I pointed to the place where Hayes had gone over the wall. Your father, says Egan, looked on probably a minute, and I saw General Hayes riding along trailing a rebel flag. Your father asked me if they had turned. I said, yes, see, General Hayes has one of their flags. And Meade just sort of stands there for a moment and is just looking on. And then he simply says to Egan, your father said, and this is Egan telling George Meade Jr., your father said, I don't care for their flag. And he rides off. And so we know that George Meade sees this moment.
He's like, good.
He's like, just say, he's not endorsing it per se. He's, maybe he has thoughts about, whether this is professional or not.
He's going to allow it.
But he's going to allow it. I don't care for their flag. And he rides away.
Judge George Meade, I'll allow it.
I'll allow it. Yeah, exactly. But he's not the only Army commander, as we've established, who does see this moment. Across the field, Frederick Colston in the Confederate Artillery Reserve Brigade, he's serving under E.P. Alexander. This will be a while later. Most of these Confederate accounts come from several decades later, noteworthy. But he is going to say that General Lee turned to me. This is 1897, he writes this. General Lee turned to me and said, ride forward and see what that cheering means. They can see that there's cheering half a mile distant in the front of the enemy's lines, as he describes it. Then he says, I started forward. I found that it was a Union general galloping down his line, and so reported to General Lee and said to Colonel Alexander, as I backed my horse off, this is Lee's words, he's quoting him, I can understand what they have to cheer for. but I thought it might be our own people. And so that's what we know. Lee can see there's cheering. He can see that there's a Union officer riding in front of their lines, but what's going on over there?
Oh, so they might not be able to directly see the flag trail, but
I don't think they see the flag. They can see the ride. They can see that there's something happening, that there's a bit of commotion, that there's some incident taking place outside of the normal events of a battle.
Right. And you guys know that we always have to be very mindful of these post-war accounts, especially as we're getting many years on, or decades in this case. But it almost makes me wonder if this is something that he is corroborating by other things that have since come out, so that, okay, yeah, Lee had asked me to do this. It really wasn't a big deal until he maybe read an account from one of the federal side, and he's real, oh, that's what I was seeing.
Perhaps, but here's where, and I have considered that before, here's where I think that I do buy that he witnessed everything that he's purporting.
Okay.
And it's because while this is 1897, certainly 34 years later, the only major popularly published account that would have come out about this was Shields' account, which won't come out itself until 1919.
Ah.
So up to this point, almost every soldier's account about this is a private piece of correspondence or regimental history. And it's perhaps that many veterans of both sides are reading these regimental histories of the 1880s, 1890s, that period, maybe even monument dedication speeches that are mentioning this by this point. But the fact that he does write this in a national source. I think this one comes from Confederate Veteran Magazine.
Oh man, what a subscription!
It's say what we will, but it's a gold mine for some pretty good accounts. Just don't read the don't read the.
I'm canceling all my other subscriptions. There's only one.
Some good historical detail, but don't read the editorial section.
Right.
But the other piece of that, I think, is it's. Maybe he did this intentionally, but it's just vague enough where it's like you can tell sometimes when you read. I'm sure we're all familiar with this phenomenon. You'll read an account from someone, and it's like word for word in some instances the account of someone else that was published before, and you're like, oh, his impressions are clearly colored by what he read elsewhere. But I think it's just vague enough.
Yeah.
And the other reason why I think that this is relatively reliable is Arthur Fremantle. In his 3 months in the southern states, published just within a few months of his return to Great Britain, almost as soon after the battle as you can get. The Civil War still going on. He'll write in equally vague terms that we heard a long and continuous Yankee cheer, which we at first imagined was an indication of an advance. But it turned out to be their reception of a general officer whom we saw riding down the line, followed by about 30 horsemen. And so he is seeing this throng of people cheering. It's the only account that I've seen that says that there were 30 people participating in the ride. None of the Union accounts say that. But from a distance,
that comes from Fremantle's what is biography called? Different Dreams, right?
Yes. Exactly.
30 is an
excellent reference.
30 is I haven't gotten enough of the quotes in for this Gettysburg 160 cycle. I was like, I got to get that one in. 30 riders it sounds like two things. One, entourage. I mean, you got your people with you. You got your staff with you. We'll all just... You remember I mentioned the two staff officers earlier just kind of fell in line with, okay, here's what we're doing. I wonder if the rest of them are like, here we all go. But I wonder how many flags. He talks about 17. 30 riders, half of them with flags, maybe?
I was thinking maybe a headquarters guard, like a portion of cavalry or something.
And I think maybe what he's seeing, is you have the... we know on the Union side they describe in detail the flag ride itself. It's between 1 and 3 individuals, depending on what moment we're talking about.
Right.
But from a distance, if you see this throng of people cheering, I'm sure that some of them maybe join. If he goes around a handful of times, some of them join in just being there, riding along as well. Does it go further down the do men just start riding in general, even if they're not trailing flags? So some of those details.
This is how the wave was invented in stadiums.
This is it.
This is how it started. The right flank of the Yankee line.
Going a little forward chronologically to 1903, we have another account from William Pogue, artillery battalion commander in William Dorsey Pender's division, which will be Trimble's division on July 3rd after Pender's mortal wounding July 2nd. And he'll place several high-ranking Confederate officers, several known people who witness at least some portion of this, as best we can tell. He'll say, Will Pogue, that he was given an order to limber to the front. Before starting, I began to be perplexed and disturbed by seeing small bodies of men coming back, and the number increasing every moment until the awful truth began to force itself upon me that the attack had failed. At this very critical moment, General Pickett appeared on the line of my guns on horseback, and near one of them, looking intently to the front. Pickett rode and said after saluting, Pogue rode to Pickett and said after saluting, General, my orders are that as soon as our troops get the hill, I am to move as rapidly as possible to their support, but I don't like the look of things up there. And he said that Pickett made no reply. He does admit they don't know each other. Pickett has no idea who this officer is coming to him and giving him this information. Pickett made no reply, didn't even turn his head to see who I was, but continued to gaze with an expression on his face of sadness and pain. And so what he's looking at is this perplexing, disturbing moment where he says that they can see men retreating, but also there's a bit of excitement in this one concentrated area. And so he doesn't outright say we saw a Union officer, didn't see flags, but I think we can corroborate, enough of those details that timing is, he's seeing the commotion probably.
Well, that guy gets two moments because he gets to see that moment, from across the field, but he also gets to witness one of the first Pickett reactions to this disaster.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point.
That's got to be one of the first, if not the earliest account of just in terms of the timeline of how he is despondent, forlorn.
Yeah.
I'd say that's got to be the first account in the day of him behaving that way.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild.
Pogue will add then a little
Great
bit.
Great band, the Pogues, by the way. Great band. Just for those music people out there.
He'll add a little bit more to this then, saying that it was at that instant a Virginia flag was borne rapidly along and in rear of the stone wall by a horseman. Now, I think a brief note here on technical terminology here. No state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia flags appear to have been utilized at Gettysburg, despite what you'll see on the Virginia Memorial. Only there because Confederate St. Andrew's Cross battle flags are not allowed under the confines of Battlefield Memorial Association, then the War Department, and then National Park Service up until pretty much the Civil Rights era of the 1950s and 60s. You'll start to see some. But he says Virginia flag. He must mean probably an Army of Northern Virginia flag, as best I can tell. But he says, General, is that Virginia flag carried by one of our men or by the enemy? Pickett, again, says nothing. There's a common theme here. But, he doesn't elaborate much else upon that other than, there's this question of, who's carrying that flag? Doesn't even say really dragging, just borne rapidly along and in rear of the stone wall by a horseman. So we can add a little more context to that based on his a couple of accounts here that he sees Pickett, in that forlorn moment, as you said, Pat.
Yeah.
But can see some commotion and then puts the pieces together. That commotion appears to be in relation to a Union officer dragging a flag.
Yeah, all of this is at our expense.
Yep. And then the last Confederate-related account that we can see, this is probably, I guess we could say, almost a third-hand account, so take it with a grain of salt. But David Shields, in that 1919 account, he'll talk about how he's visiting the battlefield at one point in time. And actually, this is where it's third hand, it's George Thornton Fleming, who was the author of that Life and Letters of Alexander Hayes. This isn't even in the section that Shields himself wrote, but Fleming says in a subsequent conversation with David Shields told me, so this is your third-hand knowledge, that he was once at Gettysburg, has since forgotten his informant's name, but was told by someone that they witnessed the attack. And he goes on to say, the officer remembered witnessing it. An order was once given to pick the federal general off. A superior officer immediately countermanded the order, saying, "No, don't shoot. That's Sandy Hayes." And Hayes' dusty blonde hair, he got the nickname Sandy, probably around his West Point years. But Fleming would say Captain Shields, in the lapse of years, has forgotten this informant's name, but is positive the officer interceding was Longstreet. It is entirely in the range of possibility that the officer may have been A.P. Hill, He says it may have been Pickett, who was also at West Point with Hayes, but ultimately Fleming concludes the story has a distinct Longstreet flavor and is in keeping with his kind heart. So we can say that at least Lee and maybe 2 Confederate Corps commanders, Hill and Longstreet, a division commander in Pickett, Arthur Fremantle, Pogue, Colston, several of these other officers, all witness something. They don't exactly know what they're seeing.
Right.
That Longstreet one, if that actually happened, I think that adds another fascinating layer to this story of, even if it's not Longstreet, but just someone, if they give an order, pick that man off, and it's countermanded, no, don't do it.
Yeah,
and they recognize him as
yeah.
Hayes. That adds another piece to the story. But that I can't corroborate with literally anything else other than.
Do they comment on this in the later years as this story does become more of a popular story? Like the guys that, like Lee, Longstreet, some of the bigger names that think they saw this moment in real time, maybe not knowing what it was, but when they go, oh, I guess we saw the flag dragging. Do they have thoughts on that? Like, well, that's kind of lame or whatever.
With Lee dying, just 5 years after the war,
right.
We don't, of course, get a memoir or anything like that from Lee.
Right.
Longstreet in Manassas to Appomattox, he doesn't make any mention of this. I don't think he mentions Hayes at all, which is rather interesting because we can see in Hayes's correspondence and those around him that even if they weren't friends, they were friendly, that he has some sort of acquaintanceship with Longstreet. Maybe not quite what Hayes and Grant had, which was a rather close relationship that's only separated because they take 2 totally different life paths, career paths, but then they'll come back together in the spring of 1864.
But Grant and Longstreet, so, friends of friends, you can kind of see how that all works together.
Absolutely. Yep. You can definitely, trace
Were they
all
both
that,
at the wedding for Julia and Grant?
Good question. I don't know if Hayes was or not. That's a good question. I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I haven't looked at this in a while, but I'll give a shameless plug here. I don't think we've talked at all yet about Pennsylvania and the Civil War, but PennCivilWar.com. I'll hint at it. PennCivilWar.com. I did a 4-part series called I don't even know what I called it. U.S. Grant and Hayes. But it's a 4-part series about their careers, the correspondence, how we know that they were in some ways connected. And I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, that I have an account in there of Hayes writing home in the spring of 64 after Grant has come east as commander of all U.S. armies. And I think he makes mention of this is the first time that they've seen each other since West Point. So since they've graduated from West Point right before Mexico, because even in Mexico, one goes to the 4th U.S. Infantry, the other to the 8th. So it's been close to 20 years by that point in time. A lot of life has happened. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And
good to see you, mate. Let's go win the war.
Yep.
Right.
And that's a thing that Hayes, really is looking forward to. We can see in his correspondence is he'll have this line where he refers to Abraham Lincoln as a saint, Grant as his prophet, and this is a couple weeks before Hayes dies. He'll write a letter to Andrew Curtin, who he now respects by this point in time. Further giving that sense of that progression. Okay. Yep. And Hayes is one of his purposes in writing is to let Curtin know there's no McClellanism or any other manism in this army, as he says. And he says that if I continue to hear this, I will send forces to Washington to fumigate the halls of Congress. That portion is a line from a letter that is censored in the published versions. The National Archives version, the Gettysburg National Military Park version, you can see that line is in there, but it's not in the published version. But anyway, in that same letter, Hayes talks about how wonderful it is that Grant is now in command of all of these armies. Saint, prophet, those sorts of terms are being thrown around. And then Hayes says, I would request a promotion. The firm of Lincoln and Stanton, forwarders of stars, has forgotten to forward mine, he says, kind of tongue-in-cheek. But that, among several other pieces of correspondence where he says, I would love to be promoted to Major General in an army commanded by Grant before I get killed, he says in one line, and then he's killed about 2 weeks later at the Wilderness. But in those weeks leading up to that, Hayes very much wants to reacquaint himself with Grant, calls upon headquarters a few times, finally catches up with him. Hayes will have Grant will hand Hayes a picture, probably CDV, that he says to Hayes, send this home to your family, and he signs it. And Annie Hayes' wife, soon to be widow, she'll keep it. It's published in a Pittsburgh newspaper article years later. So that relationship there between Hayes and Grant is one that's separated by time, separated by different career paths, by 2 decades of life that will take them sort of in 2 totally different directions. But it's one of those classic moments where they may not have talked directly in almost 20 years, but when they come back together, it's like they just pick up that conversation where they left off. And so that's another piece, of the Hayes story, not directly related to this, but is something else that's giving him optimism. This pessimistic guy of the winter of 1862-63, traders on the home front, now through 63 has been able to rejoin the war, has had his greatest hour at Gettysburg, has cemented himself as a figure who was instrumental in the Union defense of Cemetery Ridge and in this symbolic gesture of reaction in the immediate aftermath to it. And now he's even more optimistic, winter of 63 into 64, because now his old pal and a guy who he feels is perfectly competent is about to be named commander of all the armies.
So we're winding down here. We're running low on time. So let's just cover, he is killed in action at the Wilderness. Let's touch on that very briefly. And then let's wind this story down and put a bow on it the way you like to do that, because I do want to give Penn Civil War and some of your other works a few minutes on the show, because Matt and I are more than just the podcast hosts, or more than just the park rangers that we are. So we want to make sure that the other work you do gets a few minutes. But let's talk about how he meets his end in the war, and sort of the rest of the story as you think let's do that in about 5-10 minutes. Think we can cover that in about 5-10 minutes?
Yeah,
let's do that. All
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So through the winter of 63 to 64, while there's optimism, Hayes is going to have rheumatoid arthritis that'll keep him bedridden for quite a while. So he is once again dealing with ill health. A horse falls on him. But nevertheless, going into the spring campaign, he's now, has new people around him. Unfortunately, due to accusations at the Battle of Morton's Ford of drunkenness on the battlefield. So that he has in common with Grant as well.
Yeah, they like to party, all right?
In the reorganization of the Army of the Potomac under Meade, Hayes not only doesn't receive that promotion that he quite wants to Major General, doesn't get that second star from the firm of Lincoln and Stanton, as he says, but he's actually effectively demoted to brigade command. And how it'll ultimately be reasoned, the rationale for it, and I buy this. I think that we have the accusations on the side, but the real reason is, with the reorganization of this army, there are simply too many posts, or too many competent, capable officers deserving of these posts, and not enough posts to go around.
Right.
And so he'll be given a brigade in the Second Corps. At that critical intersection of the Brock Road, the Orange Plank Road at Wilderness Battlefield on the morning of May 5th, 1864, Hayes is just in front of his men, killed instantaneously with a bullet to the skull, and we'll meet his end there. Immediately, we can see all through the ranks of the federal forces that this is a moment of deep lament for everyone in the Federal Army of the Potomac. Secretary of War Stanton, General Hayes is killed. He simply says in a memorandum. Winfield Hancock, Corps Commander. Brigadier General Alexander Hayes, that dauntless soldier whose intrepid and chivalric bearing on so many battlefields had won for him the highest renown, was killed at the head of his brigade on the 5th. George Meade says Hayes, in going to repair the break in his line, was shot dead while gallantly leading his command in the thickest of the fight. And then this will impact no one more than Ulysses S. Grant, who is simply going to say in his official correspondence with Henry Halleck, General Hayes was killed yesterday. Among the killed, we have to deplore the loss of Hayes. But Horace Porter, who in his famous account, campaigning with Grant, is going to describe what he witnessed of the moment Grant received this news at his headquarters. I returned to headquarters and carried to him the sad intelligence of Hayes's death. General Grant was by no means a demonstrative man, but upon learning the intelligence I brought, he was visibly affected. He was seated upon the ground with his back against a tree, whittling pine sticks. He sat for a time without uttering a word, and then speaking in a low voice and pausing between sentences, said, Hayes and I were cadets together for 3 years. We served for a time in the same regiment in the Mexican War, He was a noble man and a gallant officer. I'm not surprised that he met his death at the head of his troops. It was just like him. He was a man who would never follow, but would always lead in battle. And 4 years later, in 1868, when Grant is campaigning for the presidency, he'll visit Pittsburgh, and he's traveling around the town with Jared Brush, mayor of Pittsburgh, and he'll request, can we visit Allegheny Cemetery? And Brush is going to comment upon the fact that Grant spent a few minutes, sat down on one of the cannon near the monument, and appeared to be wrapped in deep thought. I turned aside, and when I again looked at Grant, he was weeping like a child. And so Hayes is going to meet his end before the end of the war, deeply impacting those who are around him, not least of which was the man at the top, was Grant himself. In the aftermath of the war, we start to see a lot of those regimental histories of the men in Hayes' division, certainly of the 63rd Pennsylvania, though a 3rd Corps regiment deeply tied to Hayes as the man who had raised that regiment and commanded it through that horrible leg wound that he sustained in 1862. But we'll start to see more and more veterans' speeches at the likes of reunions, monument dedications, regimental histories, memoirs. Will mention that this was not only a seminal moment of the Battle of Gettysburg, witnessing this flag ride, but of the war. It stands out to some of these men as a quintessential moment of the war itself. And all of that will really kind of lead up to the creation of a painting by a landscape artist named Audley Dean Nichols, who is going to be commissioned by David Shields, who will serve as a historical advisor on the creation of the painting. This will happen around 1910. Nobody knows specifically what happened to the painting itself, the original of it. Everything you see today is a photograph of it, is a reproduction of it. But as the story goes, David Shields' sister, Wilhelmina, I think is how you pronounce her name, in 1937 will acquire the painting after David Shields dies. He apparently had the original, and it goes missing after that point. And there is some evidence to suggest that she had told Shields that she thought it was offensive, that she didn't like that it, in this era of reconciliation, 75 years after the war, that wasn't the representation of Gettysburg that she liked to see. And so did she hide it? Did she destroy it? Nobody really knows. And to this day, it's still the famous missing painting, as an article in Western Pennsylvania Magazine stated 2003, so 20 years ago now. But yeah, still, I don't know if it's an active hunt for this painting, but if anybody listening knows where this painting is,
that painting's
let
gone.
us know.
That painting's gone, brother. I guarantee
Codie,
you that got destroyed.
you hinted at the painting was supposed to be made into a frieze or a plaque and put on the Hayes Monument. Is that the case?
Yeah, so when the Hayes Monument goes up, as I mentioned, it's not dedicated until the 1980s, until
Which is wild.
July 3rd, 1982. Yeah, it's absolutely wild. The John Geary, Alexander Hayes, and I think John Given statues, if I'm not mistaken, go up. All three at Geary, Humphreys, and Hayes. Poor Humphreys, his monument literally to this day has never been dedicated. Geary doesn't
Let's
have...
go dedicate
We can
it.
go
Let's
dedicate
go
it.
write some words and dedicate it. We can do it.
Yep. So Hayes gets his in 1982. Geary, I think, is in something like 2000.
Yeah.
But poor Humphreys never has his dedicated. But at the base of the monument, Shields wants a relief of this Audley Dean Nichols painting, and you can Google the title of the painting for those listening is "Victory: Turn of the Tide of the Rebellion," and the Sewickley County or the Sewickley Historical Society has it's not very high resolution, but you can find a version of it there. For a higher resolution, just look up Life and Letters of Alexander Hayes on Internet Archive, Google Books, HathiTrust, your internet repository of choice. There's a black and white version of it, a kind of an etched version of this artistic depiction of Hayes, Courts, and Shields, cheering men in the background, wounded Confederate soldiers in the foreground. But Shields wants that to be at the base of the monument, and it's denied. The War Department doesn't accept it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Shields will get into this dispute between its erection in 1915 and his own death in almost 20 years later, that he doesn't like the location of the monument, doesn't like that a lot of people won't fully understand where Hayes commanded. They won't see this depiction of the flag ride, and he wants that to be why people remember Alexander Hayes, to the point that Shields himself is buried, almost within eyesight of it, despite having no personal connection to the town of Gettysburg itself. When he passes, he's buried in Gettysburg National Cemetery on a clear winter day without any leaves on trees. You can all but stand at Shields' grave and look across and just about see Hayes' statue. The angle is just a little bit off, but for all intents and purposes, he's within eyeshot of what he appears to have seen as kind of the seminal moment of his life. Awesome. And where I'll kind of lead all this, because I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. There's so much more to this story. I hope to have this all published at some point in time.
And we will have you back to talk about the book when
Absolutely.
it's out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But this will all lead up to what I believe is the only real kind of recreation of this event, reenactment of this event, in 1988 at the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Michael Krause from Soldiers and Sailors Memorial in Pittsburgh is the Union commander on the field at that reenactment. And I talked with him a few years ago about recreating this moment. I had seen on social media, a reference to the fact that this was recreated. There was a picture of him as General Hayes at that reenactment. And he talked about how approaching it in a tasteful way, in his words, just didn't want to do it without people understanding the context of it, because it was a true event. We weren't making anything up. We were doing it to understand what that moment was like. Then he talked about the mechanics of it as maybe the only person other than Hayes who has ever done this in Gettysburg. He says it's really hard to drag a flag behind a horse. Your arm is backwards, your horse is going forward, you're trying to negotiate through all kinds of debris still on the field right after Pickett's charge. And then he said about the reaction to it was as close as he would have imagined it might have been in 1863. Which I wonder, not going to get too much into this, but I wonder, I don't think that would be the same probably reaction today with how Confederate memory is broadly interpreted by a large section of the Civil War community.
It would stir my dander up, and I would be hooting and hollering in a way that Hayes would have been familiar with, and Mr. Cross would have been familiar with.
But he said it was like like throwing a stone in water. When we started out, people were cheering. Then it would cause people to turn and look like, what's that noise? They saw us coming, threw their hats in the air. I'm the only person that's ever done it except for Hayes. I've been reenacting over 50 years. That was the only moment of my whole life where the hair stood up on the back of my neck and my arms. It was just electrifying having that scene actually be possible. The moment took over, and I was glad to have represented that.
Wow.
And, one other account here that I absolutely want to mention before we wrap it all up, just to kind of bring it full circle, is how David Shields contextualized this key moment of his life, this moment that he spent pages writing about in detail, corroborating what so many others had written in their unpublished sources, notably. And he'll note the fact that Hayes wrote in the immediate aftermath of the battle, "It will not be credited," regarding his own division's performance. This is a feature of the battle most historians have neglected, and Gettysburg guides and pamphlet makers knew nothing of, is what Shields will add to that. And in many respects, he's right. This is a moment that, as we've already established, is relatively forgotten, relegated to footnotes and brief mentions in battle histories. But when we piece it all together, we have 2 diary entries recorded on the day it happened. One observer of those 2 said Hayes had 1 rebel flag. Others said he had hands full of rebel flags. One man said Hayes struck his steed on the flank with his saber. Another stated he was trailing one of the captured flags under the feet of his horse. One mentioned Hayes dragged a secesh flag after him. Nearby, a comrade insisted that the flag was tied to the tail of a horse. Another claimed that he waved the flag over his head. One veteran recalled that Hayes trailed the captured colors on the ground to display the word Harper's Ferry. Another said that he could have sworn the general shouted, "So we wipe out Harper's Ferry." Another said that he heard Hayes shout, "We are fierce for the right, they are fierce for the wrong." Another said that he seized a rebel color and screamed, "Damn Meade and damn his reinforcements," when George Meade offers to send reinforcements to this section of the line. Another says that Meade is asked, as we have established where General Hayes was, then said, I don't care for their flag. One recollection says that Hayes was coatless, waving his waving his hat, shouting like the rest of us. And even several Confederate officers half a mile distant could see a Union officer galloping down the line with a flag borne rapidly and in rear of a stone wall by a horseman. So all of this, we can piece together. And Hal Shields would encapsulate all of that, meld it all together. As he said, the years have rolled away, but out of their dimness comes ever the fond remembrance of that wonderful ride at Gettysburg, when our gallant general leading, his aides following at a fast gait, the trailing flags, the resounding cheers of the enthusiastic troops, the spirit of victory that animated us. In all the story of the war, there comes to me nothing like it. I can still see General Hayes victoriously trailing the emblems of treason on the now hallowed ground. Shall history fail to keep in bright renown this story of Hayes and the 3rd Division of the 2nd Corps at Gettysburg? There is due them their just measure of honor, and for General Hayes, their superb commander, that undying fame, his talents, and his deeds, and his heroic death have won. In the story of Alexander Hayes and the 3rd Division at Gettysburg, there is one commanding thought, and that is victory. And that's how he wrapped up his thoughts on everything, the inconsistencies, how he remembered the event itself. He says that, regardless of how we all remember what happened, it happened. We need to remember it, and it encapsulates that idea of Union victory.
God, I love this story.
Yes. Yeah, what a way to wrap that, too.
Well done, Cody. This is, you know what? Certain people possess the modern ownership of legacies, and it's not always for the better. You go to some sites, and you're like, man, I can't believe you're the person telling this story. Cody, you're the man to have this story right now. You and Rich do a fantastic job with it. I cannot wait for you to put this all. When you say publish, you're talking book, right?
So it started as, Matt alluded earlier to my work with the Park Service. Started as a lecture at a conference in their fall seminar with the Gettysburg Foundation at Gettysburg National Military Park in 2019. Was supposed to be published as an essay in a book of essays with other presenters. Due to personnel changes, due to COVID, it got delayed and then ultimately canceled. And so shopping it around now to publishers in the form of a book. Yep.
Awesome. Well, when that book's out, we'll stump for it here.
Yes, we will.
Let's do a blitz on you outside of the Seminary Museum. I mean, anything you want to talk about, any works that you're proud of, anything you want to just put out into the world, any shout-outs, any coworkers, any inspirations. But let's do a 2-minute blitz with you to take it home. Thanks for coming on the show. But Cody, the floor is yours. Talk about whatever you want, where they can follow you, any of that stuff.
Yeah, really appreciate you guys having me. Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, seminaryridgemuseum.org and seminaryridgeeducation.org. A lot of digital educational content we've created there, largely for use by students, but you can take a look at some other things there that are useful to general audiences as well. Go to our website, to our events page. That's typically where you'll see, the best ways that you can interact with me at tours, at appearances, at Civil War roundtables, things like that. That you can, see what I do professionally there. Our walking tours, our Sunset at the Seminary programming, which Matt will be part of one this summer as well. With Pete Mealy, Caleb Kuzmierzik, and the rest of our staff there as well. So on my day job, you can find me there.
Yes,
our summer hours.
It's an amazing museum. It really is.
And
folks.
Cody's going to let us in the cupola someday because he'll do that for his friends.
Yeah, I will. Matt's been up.
I have.
Matt's been up there. I see. Oh, great, Cody. He's at 3 years to meet me in person. You take my co-host to the cupola. I see how it is, guys.
Well, we'll get you guys there certainly. So let me know when you'd like to come up.
Another quick shout out to Penn Civil War. Obviously, we've alluded to it a bunch. So what's that? Because that's you and a few others other than just Rich, right?
Yeah. So Rich Condon, Jake Wynn, Kendrick Gibbs. Ironically, I'm the only one of the 4 founding contributers who still resides in Pennsylvania. But we haven't been as active there lately. But all of that still lives on penncivilwar.com. A ton of great scholarship that we especially wrote, between 2020 and 2022 or so. But periodically, we'll certainly put up videos and new blogs, essays. You can find all that on social media platforms as well as penncivilwar.com.
I enjoy that a lot of this world looks at the initial COVID year in this really negative light, and every time I'm like, you know what? If you're a writer, that was a great year. You got a ton of time to research and write. Our show came really to life during that time. Like, I know I heard you say that, and I was like, yeah, you got a ton of time to write over that time. That was probably some good years because I love writing. So,
and even if for some of these things that in my case, I'll admit, some of those projects aren't active or haven't been active for a while, but that all still lives there. It still exists there.
You got to work on them.
You got to work on it, and more progress than I've made probably at any other point. So there's a silver lining there. But for anybody who is just coming into it now, they can still go read that as if it was written today. There's no difference.
Sure. Well, I'm excited to come see you at the Seminary Museum. Like Codie's saying, go see him in person if you can. You're probably going to be swamped in July. 160. You guys got a lot going on for that at the museum this year?
We do. We have our annual anniversary on the Ridge programming. I think this year we're at it's more than 30. I won't put an exact number on it. Last year was 24. This year it's more than 30. Walking tours, real-time programs, guest presentations.
My goodness.
Between June 30th and July 3rd. Programs we're putting on ourselves, as well as guest presenters, working with American Battlefield Trust on some educational offerings, children's activities, you name it. We have it going on. So come see us at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center.
Well, you heard it. Get in your cars, put on the History of Things podcast, take yourself to Gettysburg, enjoy the town, enjoy the battlefield, and then take yourself over to the Seminary Museum and get yourself involved in the programming, meet the fine staff over there, our good friend Codie Eash. I guess the last question I'm going to ask you, since we're not going to focus a ton on battles and banter because, at the end of the day, Codie, you haven't really been on the show when I've been on the show, and I don't want to give you that much airtime about battles and banter. But no, I'm just kidding. Does Denethor deserve a break? Were you there for when I did this?
Pat, no, we're not going down this road.
All right, fine. We'll talk about this another day then. But no, I am very seriously appreciative of you coming here and recording with us. Thank you for telling this story. Alexander Hayes is a badass. You, sir, are a badass. I cannot wait to come see you do your thing in person. We got a lot coming up here. The rest of this summer on the History of Things podcast. We'll keep it short and sweet. Scott Hartwig's second episode, Civil War Memory of the Battle of Gettysburg. We take you literally off the field with the Confederate forces as they are shrinking back to the tree line. We talk about the Federal soldiers screaming Fredericksburg and Harper's Ferry, and then we take a look at how these three terrible days in July are remembered for the duration of the war, the years afterwards, all the way up to right now. And that is, again, another conversation with somebody that all of us consider as an absolute legend. So that's coming up. We've got episodes with Melissa Wynn. Obviously, you've heard the beginnings of the story of John Rollins and his relationship with General and then later President Grant. There's an episode likely either out right now or imminently to be released, focusing on that relationship through the eyes of Vicksburg. We got tons of stuff. Eric Money's epic Pennsylvania Reserves episode is on deck, plus so much more. Matt Borders published another damn book. I mean, we're on pace for like a book a season here. So
not quite, but close.
If you want to get caught up on a lot of the in-house stuff, behind the scenes, off-mic stuff, our 50th episode this year, our mid-year episode this year was our 50th episode. We had managed, guys, again, I know we've already celebrated this and we're still a little hungover from it, but we did 50 episodes and kept it rolling. So once again, round of applause to all of us. But you can find out more about what's happening with the History of Things podcast behind the scenes and off mic with that 50th episode celebration show. But otherwise, for my producer behind the scenes, Parker, for our guest today, Codie Eash from the Seminary Museum in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, from Penn Civil War, from Battles and Banter podcast, for my co-host with the most, 4 times published. I can say thrice. I don't know how to do. What's 4? What's 4, man? Quadruply published. Many books now. Many Borders books. That's your new name now. Many Borders books. Anyway, for my co-host Matt Borders, I am your co-host Pat McGuire, saying thank you all for listening to the History of Things podcast. We will catch you all later.
Have a good night.
follow Pat and Matt on their social medias at History Things with Pat and at Matt Borders Books. Have a question, comment, or compliment for the show? Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show.